Ned Stark rose from his seat in the pre-dawn dimness of the solar, the table before him strewn with maps, half-written letters, and wax-sealed messages awaiting couriers. A single candle still burned low, casting unsteady shadows across his weary face. By now he was accustomed to sleepless nights, to the guilt and tension coiling within him like a serpent that refused to loosen its grip. His decision to hold the Lannister children hostage had changed him irrevocably. Yet every time he felt the old pang of conscience, he thought of Bran, pushed from a tower window. He thought of the knife pressed to his family's throat by the ceaseless machinations of Tywin and Cersei, and so he pressed forward, matching cunning with cunning, cruelty with an unyielding will that felt alien in his own bones. Outside the windows, the city was still. Soon, King's Landing would stir to life in the swirl of heated whispers about the great council that had erupted into near chaos the previous day. The Iron Throne remained vacant, but Stannis Baratheon and Renly Baratheon now camped side by side beyond the walls, each claiming the right to rule. Lord Tywin Lannister had arrived, his armor gleaming, his eyes brimming with arrogance and cold fury, demanding the release of his daughter and grandchildren. Dorne was represented by Oberin Martell, whose hatred for the Lannisters radiated like heat off desert sand. Tully bannermen stood to the side, uncertain but resentful of the raids in their homeland. Even the High Septon had tried to mediate, though none present truly cared for the faith's authority when crowns and kingdoms were at stake. Ned gathered up a few of the letters he had composed while others slept. The first was addressed to Robb Stark at Moat Cailin, instructing his son to fortify that gateway to the north and remain vigilant. The second was a missive to his bannermen in the north, urging patience as events in the capital developed. The third letter, with a bit more trepidation, was intended for the Eyrie, once again requesting assistance or at least a public show of support. He knew Lisa Arryn would likely refuse, but if there was any chance to coax the Vale Knights into supporting a negotiated peace, or supporting the king Ned meant to place on the throne, he had to try. He folded the parchment, pressed the wax seal, and stood. He donned his cloak and belted ice, the great sword of House Stark around his waist. Felt heavier than usual. Perhaps that weight was only in his mind. A stir at the door preceded the entrance of one of his most trusted men, Jory Castle's cousin, Tomard Castle, who had come south to serve as part of Ned's personal guard after Jory's death. Tomard bowed his head. "My lord," Tomard said quietly, "Ser Barristan wishes to speak with you in the yard. He asked me to fetch you at once." Ned smothered a faint flicker of concern, recalling that Ser Barristan Selmy had been present yesterday, standing as tall and stoic as ever while the lords bickered. An honorable man in a time of twisted alliances, a man who might be as uneasy with Ned's tactics as Ned was himself. "Thank you, Tomard," Ned said. "I'll go at once." In the courtyard, dawn was a pale hint on the horizon, painting the high walls of the red keep with faint gold. Ser Barristan stood by a stone balustrade, arms crossed, his white cloak catching the faint breeze. He turned when he heard Ned's approach, bowed his head respectfully, and wasted no time. "My Lord Hand," he said, "or Lord Protector, as it were. I must speak plainly." Ned nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "I served 3 kings," Barristan said. "I have tried to uphold the ideals of my vows, even when the kings I served acted rashly or cruelly. I bore witness to Aerys Targaryen's madness and to Robert Baratheon's many failings. Now I find myself in a city where children are held hostage, and the realm teeters on the brink of war, maybe multiple wars. I've stood aside and guarded whatever occupant sat the throne, or claimed it all my life. But I cannot help feeling that something here has gone terribly wrong. Where is the honor that once guided you, Lord Stark? Has King's Landing twisted you so far from the man you were?" Ned pressed his lips together. He had expected this conversation, perhaps not so soon, but inevitably. Barristan's sense of honor was legendary, and like all men of principle, he chafed under the necessity of harsh tactics. Ned had no desire to lie to the knight or to feed him hollow excuses. "In the north," Ned said softly, "we have a saying, 'Give me leave to hope and I'll hold on to honor.' But if that hope is stripped away, If your enemies have tried to murder your children and plunge the realm into chaos, sometimes you have but one choice. Cersei Lannister nearly destroyed my family. Her father is every bit as merciless. If I let them move first, my children, and the children of the realm, would be caught in a war that devours everything. Barristan's pale eyes flicked to the horizon, where the first banners of daylight waved. I will continue to serve, he said quietly, because I swore an oath to the crown. But I pray you remember that these means, they come at a cost. A king's guard or a hand's guard can defend children with steel, but we cannot protect their souls from the evils we commit in their name. Ned nodded. I know, Ser Barristan. 7 help me, I know. He placed a hand briefly on the knight's shoulder in a gesture of respect. We must do what we can to limit bloodshed, but I cannot, in good conscience, lay down my arms while Tywin Lannister breathes threats at the gates. The knight studied him a moment longer, then bowed. Ned watched him depart, feeling the old ache, the voice within that said this was not who he was meant to be. Then he suppressed it. The realm was bigger than his personal scruples. If he had to bear the shame of learning from Tywin Lannister's methods, so be it. He returned inside, where the castle woke to another uneasy day. Servants bustled about, carrying trays of bread and small beer to the men stationed at each corner. The gold cloaks, now as much Ned's men as the city watch, patrolled the hallways, watchful for any sign of sabotage or infiltration. Somewhere beyond these walls, the lords who had come for the council stirred in their respective quarters or encampments. If the first day had concluded with a stalemate, the second day might prove equally tense. Ned made his way to the Tower of the Hand, where the Lannister children were housed under guard. He had set aside half of the tower, a series of interconnected chambers large enough for Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen to be kept in relative comfort, but always under lock and key when not accompanied by an escort. As he climbed the final steps, he found Sansa lingering outside the door, her expression troubled. "My lord father," she said, dropping a curtsy. "I came to see if Myrcella and I could break our fast together, but the guards said they had no orders." Ned glanced at the 2 guards, who dipped their heads. "Have they misbehaved?" he asked them quietly. "Not particularly, my lord," said the elder guard. "But your instructions were explicit. The children do not leave these chambers without permission." Ned turned to Sansa. He wanted to keep her from Joffrey, if only to protect her from that boy's unpredictable cruelty. But Myrcella was gentler, and if Ned hoped to keep some semblance of peace, perhaps letting the girls share a meal would do no harm. He nodded. "See that Lady Sansa and Lady Myrcella may take breakfast in the solar next to these chambers. Joffrey remains where he is. If he wants to eat with them, I'll decide that later. But Myrcella poses no threat." He turned to Sansa. "Mind yourself, daughter. You know how delicate things are." Sansa nodded gratefully, even as her eyes shone with a conflicted look. "Thank you, father. I'll be careful." With that, Ned entered the hallway leading to the children's rooms. Joffrey's voice sounded through the door, raised in complaint, while Tommen's softer whimpers interjected. A guard rapped on the door, and on receiving permission, Ned entered. The air was stale with tension. Joffrey sat near a window, arms folded, glaring at a plate of untouched bread and cheese. Tommen clung to a stuffed lion, eyes red from recent crying. Myrcella stood by the hearth, her hands clasped before her. She looked almost relieved to see Ned, as if her brother's scowling presence was suffocating. "Lord Stark," Joffrey spat, voice on the verge of cracking with anger. "If I were king, I'd have you thrown in the dungeon for this." It took Ned a heartbeat to swallow his disgust at the boy. He reminded himself that Joffrey was still a child, though a vindictive one. "If you were king," Ned replied evenly, "these events would not have unfolded. But you are not King Joffrey. As I told you before, you will remain here in comfort as long as your grandfather does not threaten the city." Tommen sniffled, tears pooling in his eyes. "I want to go home," he mumbled. "I want mother." The sight wrung Ned's heart more than he cared to admit. The child had done nothing to earn this. Yet Ned's stance could not waver. "Your mother is in the Red Keep," Ned said. "But you must remain under watch until matters are resolved. You are free to walk these chambers, free to read or play. Your sister can visit as well. But I cannot let you wander about." Joffrey slammed a fist against the window ledge. "Tyrant," he hissed. "You think you're better than my grandfather. At least he doesn't hide behind locked doors." Ned did not rise to the bait. "You'll see your mother later. For now, Myrcella will breakfast with Sansa. Tommen, you may go with them if you wish." He gestured for the guard to open the door. Joffrey opened his mouth to protest, perhaps outraged he wasn't also being let out. But Ned cut him off. "Your presence is not required, Joffrey. You may remain here. The guards will bring you fresh fruit and pastries if you like." And so Ned left them to it. He could sense Joffrey's growing hatred, and he knew that if the boy were ever freed, that hatred might manifest in violence. But that was a concern for another day. For the moment, Joffrey was contained. Tommen shuffled after Myrcella and the guards into the corridor, heading to the solar where Sansa waited. Even as Tommen walked, he clutched his stuffed lion, looking back at Joffrey with an expression of anxiety, as though guilty for leaving him behind. Ned descended the tower, passing a corridor where he glimpsed Arya practicing with Syrio Farrell. The Bravosi danced around her with swift, darting steps, tapping her wooden blade aside with the slightest twist of his wrist. Arya's hair clung to her brow. Her face was flushed with effort. She saw her father and flashed him a determined grin. For an instant, Ned felt the old warmth stir in him, the pride that his daughter could remain so fierce amid the gloom. He gave a faint nod and moved on, letting her continue her lesson in peace. Outside, the courtyard filled with men preparing for another day of tensions. Davos Seaworth, Stannis' loyal knight, had requested an audience. Ned found him near the main gate, accompanied by a handful of Stannis' men who had been granted permission to enter. Davos bowed as Ned approached, though his expression was grave. "My Lord Protector," Davos said, "I come on behalf of King Stannis, if I may call him that." He gave Ned a hopeful look. Ned did not correct him. "He wishes to know your timetable for declaring his claim. Renly's presence here complicates matters. The men outside the walls grow restless, and if Stannis is kept waiting too long, he might consider simply laying claim by force." Ned exhaled. "Tell him that a war in front of these walls would cost many lives. Tywin Lannister would watch from the sidelines, or perhaps even strike from behind while we're divided. Let him wait a short while longer. I'm assembling smaller councils behind the scenes, trying to ease House Tyrell into an arrangement. If I can keep Renly from openly challenging him, we may unify the Baratheon banners under one rightful king." Davos gave a small nod, a flicker of relief. "I understand, but Stannis is not a patient man. He bristles at every delay." "I know," Ned said. "Give me a few days. If I cannot broker a resolution with Renly, I will stand beside Stannis in front of the entire court, proclaim him king, and dare the others to defy us. But once that's done, we'll have no going back." Davos bowed again, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You are holding the Lannister children as hostages." His tone was cautious, as if picking his way through a field of hidden blades. "Stannis disapproves, but he sees the necessity. Still, he worries that the realm will view it as an act of tyranny." Ned's mouth tightened. "I understand the concern, but once a new king is recognized and Tywin stands down, I will release them, as soon as it's safe for my own children. Word will spread that I treated them well, that they suffered no harm." Davos nodded. "I will relay that. Thank you, my lord." With that, Davos departed, leaving Ned to reflect on how precarious everything felt. He'd pinned so many hopes on the power of hostages, on forging a wedge between Tywin's ambition and his sense of familial duty. Every step might sow seeds that would one day strangle the peace he tried to create. But for the present, it was the only course that held the city together by a fraying thread. He was about to re-enter the Red Keep when a page approached, flushed and breathless, stammering that Lord Tywin sought an audience in the throne room. Ned's shoulders tensed. "Already?" The old lion wasted no time. Perhaps Tywin sensed Ned's attempts at forging a settlement with Renly and Stannis and meant to disrupt it, or seize advantage first. In either case, Ned had no choice but to respond. He straightened his cloak, adjusted ice at his side, and made his way to the throne room. This time, Tywin arrived with fewer armed men, likely due to the strict limitations imposed. He stood near the base of the dais, wearing a more subdued attire than the previous day, black and gold with a lion's head clasp at the shoulder. His expression was as immovable as stone. A few of the small council members hovered at a respectful distance. Pycelle, Varys, Littlefinger. Cersei lingered behind Tywin, wearing a gown of deep crimson. Her eyes were red-rimmed from either anger or lack of sleep, or both. Tyrion Lannister was there, too, leaning on his cane, his mismatched eyes bright with speculation. Ned stopped a sword's length away, meeting Tywin's gaze. No formal announcements, no seats, just tension thick as cold gravy. A hush fell, echoing in the vast space beneath the Iron Throne. "Lord Lannister," Ned said in a measured tone. "You wish to speak with me?" Tywin inclined his head ever so slightly. "Lord Stark, yes. I've come to discuss the continued imprisonment of my grandchildren. I see no reason to prolong their suffering, especially when I am here, prepared to talk terms like a civilized man." Ned's jaw tightened. "Their accommodations are comfortable, I assure you. They are not in a dungeon, nor are they mistreated." "So you say?" Cersei interjected, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "I want them freed. Now. They remain under guard because we have no certainty you or your father will not turn on us the moment they leave," Ned said. He glanced at Tyrion, who watched in silence. "As soon as we have a definitive conclusion to this matter." Tywin's voice cut in. "The rightful king, is that it? You fancy Stannis will be chosen by your so-called Great Council? Or you believe you can prop him up? Does it truly matter which Baratheon claims that seat, as long as the Lannisters are cast aside?" Ned met his gaze coolly. "It matters to me, and it should matter to the realm, that we uphold the laws of succession. Joffrey is not Robert's son." Cersei's nostrils flared. "You spout that lie as if you've known my marriage bed intimately." Ned let the barb wash over him. "I have ample evidence. In time, so will every lord of the realm. If you have a defense, present it. I've heard none but accusations and attempts at intimidation." Tywin dismissed the question of incest with a flick of his gaze. He knew the truth and had no interest in openly denying it. "Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that you place Stannis on the throne. My men in the West will remain loyal to me. You cannot easily dislodge thousands of sworn swords, especially with the North so far away. Even with the might of Storm's End or the Tyrells, you'll bleed this realm white in a war against the Rock." Ned's shoulders stiffened. "War is what I'm trying to prevent." "Then free my daughter and grandchildren into my custody," Tywin pressed. "Let them return with me to the West as a sign of good faith. If I believe they are safe, that they will not be used as hostages, I'll consider negotiating a settlement. Perhaps even an alliance with the new king." Ned shook his head. "I cannot do that. If I release them now, nothing stops you from rallying an army and sweeping across the Riverlands unopposed, cutting through the Tullis, then turning south or east to threaten King's Landing." Tywin's voice was cold as a winter gale. "You dare claim that House Lannister has no honor? That we would betray a truce so easily?" Ned, remembering the burning of the Riverlands, the brutality Tywin inflicted upon the Tarbecks and Rhaen's decades past, let silence be his answer. Cersei's eyes flashed, and she took a half-step forward. Tyrion placed a hand on her arm, perhaps to remind her to keep calm. She shrugged him off, glaring at Ned with a hatred that bordered on madness. Littlefinger cleared his throat, as if sensing the tension rise to a dangerous peak. "My lords, might I suggest a more delicate approach?" Peter Baelish wore his usual sly smile. "We cannot hold the realm together by the threat of violence alone. What if we consider a royal betrothal that binds the Lannisters and Baratheons, or the Lannisters and the Starks, or, well, perhaps that is too bold, but—" "No," Ned said immediately. "I will not betroth any of my daughters to Joffrey or Tommen." Tywin's mouth curled in faint contempt. "A pity. I recall your older daughter had such hopes of marrying Joffrey. How quickly loyalties turn." Ned reined in his temper. "Time changes us all. You forced my hand. We cannot linger in stalemate forever," Pycelle ventured. "Could we not at least allow the children, sweet Myrcella and Tommen, a chance to?" Ned silenced him with a glance. He had grown adept at wielding his presence as a weapon. "I will not release them until King's Landing is secure under a lawful monarch. That's final." Tywin studied Ned in silence, and for an instant, it was as though Ned glimpsed a reflection of the man he might become, a man shaped by calculating cruelty. In Tywin's expression, Ned saw grudging respect mixed with an anger that ran to the bone. "Then we have nothing left to discuss," Tywin said. "I suggest you expedite the crowning of your precious Stannis. The sooner you do, the sooner the realm knows whom it must obey, and the sooner we might find an end to this unpleasantness." Without awaiting further dismissal, Tywin turned and strode out, his cloak swirling behind him. Cersei trailed after, glaring at Ned as though memorizing his face for future retribution. Tyrion lingered a moment, offering a mirthless smile. "Lord Stark," Tyrion said softly once his family was out of earshot, "my father is a man who does nothing by halves. If you intend to follow his example, you muse. Be ready for all that implies." Ned's eyes narrowed. "I'm aware." Tyrion nodded, a tilt of the head that might have been pity or respect. Then he, too, turned and followed the Lannister retinue. The sound of their departing footsteps echoed in the throne room. The tension left behind was thick as tar. Varys appeared at Ned's elbow, as he often did, quiet as a shadow. "My lord," Varys said in a hushed voice, "you walk a dangerous line. Tywin may yield for now, but if he senses the slightest opportunity to free his kin, he will pounce. You must be vigilant." Ned nodded slowly. "Thank you for the reminder." He glanced at Littlefinger, who had not yet departed. The master of coin's expression was one of mild amusement. "Do you have anything to add, Lord Baelish?" Littlefinger shrugged, a gesture of feigned indifference. "Only that you might consider sweetening the pot for Tywin. Gold, perhaps. Favors. Offering him partial concessions so he doesn't lunge for your throat the moment you crown Stannis. I'm certain your new queen, whoever that might be, could spare a seat on the small council for a Lannister or two. After all, power is best shared with the unscrupulous, lest they find themselves with nothing better to do than revenge." Ned grimaced. "I'll consider all options, distasteful as they may be." With that, the small group dispersed, leaving Ned in the echoing hall. The empty Iron Throne loomed behind him, jagged swords twisted and fused together. He looked back at it, remembering Robert's easy smile, remembering how once he had believed in simple truths. Now that seat was the axis around which the realm spun in turmoil. He wondered if any man was truly worthy of it. He departed soon after, emerging into the corridors where brisk activity carried on. Messengers dashed about, carrying sealed parchments from lords who were lodged in the city. The smell of toasted oats drifted from the kitchens. The clatter of armor from the yards signaled more arrivals. He was about to turn toward his solar when he noticed Oberin Martell leaning casually against a pillar, observing him with predatory grace. Ned paused, uncertain of the Prince of Dorne's intentions. Oberin pushed off the pillar and approached, his sun-kissed features set in a roguish grin. "Lord Stark, a fine morning to match all this tension." "Prince Oberin," Ned acknowledged. "You've not yet spoken your piece in these councils." Oberin's dark eyes glinted. "I've been waiting, watching. You speak of justice, of rightful kings. Yet the horrors my sister Elia endured at the hands of your precious Lannisters remain unaddressed. If you truly want to see the realm made whole, perhaps you can start by punishing those who committed atrocities under Tywin's orders." Ned did not blink. "If we prove the Lannisters guilty of crimes, they will answer for them. Elia's murder was an abomination." He remembered Rhaegar's wife, the Dornish princess, and her children, murdered in the sack of King's Landing. Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch had done the deed, but all knew whose approval they carried. You have my word, Prince Oberin. Once there is a crowned king in place to dispense justice, the men responsible will face the consequences. Oberin looked at him for a long moment, measuring sincerity. Your word might mean something, Ned Stark, more than the words of other lords I've met. But I have no faith in Lannister justice. If Stannis or Renly ascends, what assurances do I have that they will not close ranks with Tywin, sweeping the past beneath a rug for the sake of convenience? Ned set his jaw. I cannot speak for them, but I will fight for justice. That includes seeing punishment meted out to the men who slaughtered your sister and her children. Oberin's grin widened, though it had a wolfish edge. Then I look forward to seeing you keep that promise. I'll be here watching, and if the day comes when the Mountain, that big brutish dog of Tywin, comes to King's Landing, I might just have to greet him personally. Ned inclined his head. Oberin bowed with exaggerated flourish and sauntered away, leaving Ned to reflect on the many fires burning around him. Each day brought new reminders that the realm's grudges would not simply vanish once a king was crowned. Tywin's thirst for power, Dorne's thirst for vengeance, the Baratheon brothers' rivalry, Renly's alliance with the Tyrells, the Tullis' desire for relief in the Riverlands. A single misstep and everything would explode. He finally retreated to his solar, where he found Catelyn waiting. She stood by the window, her hands clasped tight, gaze turned toward the distant camps beyond the city walls. When she heard the door, she turned, relief and worry mingling on her face. How went your meeting with Tywin? She asked. Ned crossed to her side, slipping an arm around her waist and pressing his forehead to hers for a moment. A small comfort in a sea of troubles. As well as could be expected. He demands I free the children. I refused. We remain at an impasse. She leaned against him. And the others? Stannis? Renly? Ned sighed. Stannis grows impatient. Renly puffs up his chest, insisting half the realm is his for the taking. I'm trying to arrange a compromise, but it may be that a break is inevitable. Once we name Stannis king, we'll see how Renly reacts. Catelyn pursed her lips. You've done well to avoid outright war thus far. But how long can you keep all these lords at bay? Sooner or later, swords will be drawn. He tightened his hold on her. I know. Perhaps I can bring them to a final council tomorrow. Force them to confront the reality. Stannis is the true heir. Renly can accept a prominent station in his brother's reign or declare open treason. Tywin can choose to support or to remain neutral under threat of losing his blood. If all else fails, the city must be prepared for a siege. I have the gold cloaks. I have the advantage of the hostages. I'll do whatever it takes. Catelyn did not flinch from his determination. She had changed too, grown harder. I'll stand with you, even if it means war. They stood in silence, looking at the expanse beyond the windows, until a knock interrupted them. Ser Barristan entered, bowing. My lord, my lady, Lord Renly has requested an audience. He awaits you in the small council chamber. Ned drew a calming breath. Then let us go see what my lord Renly wants now. He guided Catelyn to the council chamber, where Renly sat at the head of a polished table, idly spinning a golden rose in his fingers. Beside him stood Ser Loras Tyrell, face carefully neutral. A few of Renly's bannermen from the Stormlands were present as well, though not the full complement. They rose when Ned arrived, and Renly's smile was too bright to be genuine. Lord Stark, Renly said, gesturing to a seat across from him. I hope you don't mind my taking the best seat in the room. I thought it might lighten the mood to see me in a position of authority. Ned lowered himself into the offered chair. Catelyn took a seat next to him. As you like, Ned said. What can I do for you, Lord Renly? Renly set the rose aside. I wanted a private word without the entire cast of lords breathing down our necks. You must see that half this realm will never accept my Dar brother as king. Stannis is iron, unyielding, but he has no gift for charm or negotiation. People flock to me, Lord Stark. The Reach is already in my corner, and if I can coax the Stormlands fully to heal, we'd have the largest army in the Seven Kingdoms. Ned steeled himself. I've heard this argument before. You believe your popularity outweighs the legal claim that belongs to your older brother. Renly shrugged, leaning forward, his voice dropping. The realm needs a king it can love. How many more years do we want to endure a sullen, inflexible ruler who alienates his lords? Stannis might hold the law, but I hold the hearts. I've come to make you an offer. Ally with me, not Stannis. We'll dethrone the Lannisters just as easily, perhaps more so. Your hostages won't even be necessary. I know you're squeamish about threatening children, Ned. Catelyn bristled, and Ned placed a calming hand on hers before responding. Children or not, the Lannisters must be contained if we're to avoid a war that would tear the realm apart. You speak of acceptance, Renly, but acceptance must rest on some foundation of legality. Otherwise, we're no better than the rebels we once fought. Renly studied him. Surely you recall that we rose in rebellion to unseat the Targaryens. My brother Robert had little claim save his Baratheon blood through his grandmother. Yet the realm followed him because it despised the Mad King and loved Robert. This is no different. Ned's lips twitched in a grim approximation of a smile. Robert also had Jon Arryn, your father's death at the king's command, and a confluence of events that forced many lords to pick sides quickly. This time is different. And remember, Robert was still a Targaryen cousin of sorts, closer in blood to the throne than any other rebel. You are your brother's younger sibling, overshadowed by his lawful place. Renly drummed his fingers on the table. You cling to dusty laws. What if we compromise? Crown me king, but we'll make Stannis the Hand or master of ships or something. The Stormlands and the Reach stand united behind me, and I'd offer you the wardenship of the North on more generous terms than Stannis ever would. We could end Tywin's threat together, place the children in safekeeping without further cruelty. Ned shook his head. Do you think Stannis will serve under you? He'll sooner burn the realm than bend the knee to a younger brother. A small sigh escaped Renly. He might have no choice if the realm rallies behind me. You've secured the capital. I can bring the Tyrells. That leaves the Lannisters isolated, and the Riverlands would breathe easy if we promised them redress. The Martells might keep to themselves, or they might join if I promised them justice for Elia. He paused, letting the implication hang. Ned, you want peace. I know you do. Stannis will not offer you a bloodless peace. He's too unyielding. He'll hound every lord who ever questioned his claim, demand unwavering fealty. He'll punish them if they delay. Do you want more chaos? Ned's mind spun. He had guessed Renly would propose something bold, and it was bold indeed. A quick means to unify half the realm, leaving Stannis alone with Dragonstone's limited forces. But if Ned turned his back on Stannis's rightful claim, what would it do to the realm's respect for law? And how could Ned trust that Renly, once king, wouldn't turn out as self-indulgent as Robert had in his final years? He glanced at Catelyn, who studied Renly's face with a shrewd gaze. If the realm sees that might makes right once again, she said softly, what keeps us from another conflict when some more charismatic or wealthier lord arises? By your logic, whoever has the biggest army can seize the throne at will. Is that truly the precedent you want to set, Lord Renly? Renly's smile thinned. Lady Stark, I appreciate your directness, but the realm's memory is short. It cares more for prosperity and safety than genealogies. A fair and open-handed king can make the small folk happy, keep the lords content, and preserve the peace. That's my vision. Ned rose from his seat, concluding the meeting with a single, quiet statement. I've heard your proposal. Let me think on it. But I cannot promise you what you want. Stannis's claim holds weight, even if you would dismiss it. Renly seemed disappointed but not surprised. He nodded, then signaled for his men to follow. I'll be at my quarters in the city if you wish to speak more. But do not wait too long, Ned. If Stannis or Tywin forces my hand, I'll be forced to act unilaterally. When Renly and his retinue departed, Ned stood for a long moment in the hush, feeling the press of unwelcome choices crowd in on him. The older he got, the more he realized that each choice carried a terrible weight of consequence. Once, he would have refused Renly outright. Now, after everything he had learned, he found a small sliver of temptation in Renly's words. If crowning Renly prevented an even bloodier war. But no, that path was lined with betrayals of his own code, of the rightful heir, and of any sense of justice. He would not do it. Catelyn placed a hand on his arm. No matter what we choose, someone will be unhappy. Remember that we also need to keep the North safe. Our son is gathering men. But if the war turns truly catastrophic, the price might be too high. Ned nodded. I'll proceed with Stannis. We'll do this quickly in the next day or two, and see if Tywin or Renly dare challenge it. If they do, I'll trust in our position here in the city and in the hostages. Yet even as he said it, a ghost of doubt whispered that Tywin Lannister, above all men, knew how to turn hostages into a double-edged blade. That night, Ned called a small gathering in the Tower of the Hand. Present were Catelyn, Ser Barristan, Davos representing Stannis, and a handful of northern men Ned trusted implicitly, Tomard Castle among them. They discussed strategy late into the evening, poring over maps of the city, the roads, and the potential routes Tywin might take if he decided to move an army closer. They spoke of how the gold cloaks would guard the gates, how the banners from the Vale might or might not arrive, how best to keep Renly from launching a surprise attack. I see two threats, said Davos. Renly and Tywin. Renly might attempt a coup within the city if he gathers enough men or if the Tyrells sneak a larger force in. Tywin might choose to negotiate or might try a sudden rescue mission for his family. We must ensure neither can succeed before Stannis is crowned. Ned tapped his finger on the table. We have watchers posted at all gates, and the city's guard has grown from men I trust. But men's loyalties can be bought. Littlefinger reminded me of that. A few well-placed bribes could open a gate in the night. Ser Barristan nodded solemnly. We should rotate the watch, place men of proven loyalty at key points, and ensure that no single officer holds exclusive command. That way, if someone is bought, it is harder for him to act alone. Catelyn added, What of the Red Keep's interior? The Lannister children are in the Tower of the Hand, but what if their supporters attempt to free them from within? We must protect those corridors. Ned looked to Tomard Castle. Double the guard outside their chambers. If anyone attempts to pass without my personal seal, stop them no matter who it is. And keep them away from the Queen's quarters at night, except for the supervised visits we've already established. The meeting wore on, hammering out details of security, supply lines, and the still looming presence of Tyrion Lannister, who had been making quiet inquiries around the keep. Some believed he was searching for a weakness in Ned's defenses. Others thought he might be seeking a side deal. Ned suspected both. Regardless, Tyrion remained carefully watched, though not imprisoned. He was more useful where Ned could see him. When at last the meeting ended, the night was deep and quiet. Ned and Catelyn were left alone in the flickering candlelight, exhaustion dragging at their limbs. She pressed her hand against his cheek. You must rest, she whispered. If you collapse, what good are your plans? He pulled her close. I'll rest soon, I promise. Just a moment more to gather my thoughts. She left, and Ned remained, lost in a swirl of memories and possibilities. The images came unbidden. Bran lying broken in the snow, Sansa's tear-streaked face, Arya's determined grin, Robb mustering men in the north. He thought of the White Walkers from old stories, the cold beyond the wall. He remembered Robert's last days and the heartbreak of learning how deeply the Lannisters had sunk their claws into the throne. Above all, he remembered the hollowness he felt when he decided to hold Joffrey and the others hostage. Honor had been his shield. Now he felt the weight of a new shield, pragmatism. But at what cost? Early the next morning, Ned assembled a bold plan. He ordered messengers to invite lords and their retinues to gather in the throne room at midday. This included Tywin or his designated envoy, Renly, the Tyrell representatives, Oberin Martell, Edmure Tully, and any other major house leaders present. The agenda: a final pronouncement concerning the crown. If Stannis was named king under the seal of the Great Council, Ned reasoned, at least the realm would have clarity. Perhaps that clarity would force Tywin and Renly to make a definitive choice, accept or rebel. And if rebellion came, better to face it openly than to stew in endless intrigue. When midday arrived, the throne room was a swirl of colorful banners and tense faces. Renly appeared, wearing green and gold, flanked by Ser Loras and a scattering of lords from the Reach and the Stormlands. Tywin arrived with a handful of Lannister guards, Cersei at his side in a crimson gown that seemed to burn in the dull light. Tyrion came as well, lingering behind them, his face betraying curiosity. Oberin Martell stood to one side with a faint smirk, arms crossed, while Edmure Tully hovered near the dais, anxious for any sign the Riverlands might be spared further devastation. Ser Barristan took up a central post, helm under his arm, while the gold cloaks ringed the perimeter. Stannis Baratheon entered in a crisp doublet of black, trimmed with gold thread, shadowed by Davos and a few other knights. The hush that fell was immediate. All eyes went to him. He walked with the measured step of a man prepared to endure a grim duty rather than bask in adulation. His gaze swept the hall, meeting Tywin's stony eyes, Renly's forced smile, Oberin's sardonic glance, and then settled on Ned. Ned nodded imperceptibly to Stannis, then stepped forward to address the gathering. "Lords and ladies of the realm," he began, "we have come together after the death of King Robert Baratheon and the revelations about the parentage of his supposed heirs. Through the will he left and the laws of succession, we recognize that Stannis Baratheon is Robert's lawful heir, the eldest of his remaining brothers. As protector of the realm, by Robert's own named authority, I declare that the Iron Throne is his by right." A clamor rose at once. Renly lifted his voice in protest, but it was drowned by other outbursts. Tywin Lannister said nothing, though his lips curled. Cersei hissed something at him, but he maintained a cold silence. Oberyn looked on with a flicker of amusement, arms still crossed. Tyrion raised an eyebrow, his expression giving away little. When the noise subsided enough for Ned to speak, he raised a hand. "This realm has suffered from confusion and duplicity. We end that confusion now. Stannis of the House Baratheon is the rightful king of the Undulls and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm. Let any man who denies this speak now." Renly stepped forward, a brittle smile on his face. "I deny it. I have the backing of the Reach and the love of the small folk. My brother is lawful by lineage, but the realm will not thrive under his rule. I propose that we hold a vote among the lords present. Let them choose which Baratheon they will follow." A stunned quiet met his words. Even Tywin's men shifted in surprise. A vote was unprecedented in the Seven Kingdoms, reminiscent of how the Night's Watch chose a Lord Commander, not how a king was crowned. Stannis looked as if he might burst from his skin in outrage. "The kingship is not a popularity contest," Stannis snarled. "I have the stronger claim by blood and by law. I will not stoop to beg for your approval, Renly." Renly's mouth tightened. "Then you will fail. When half the lords rise against you, you will fail. And who will that help? Tywin Lannister, perhaps. Our enemy stands in this very hall, waiting to exploit our division." Tywin's eyes narrowed at the mention of him, but he remained silent, letting them tear each other apart. Ned stepped in before the tension broke into violence. "Renly, I invited you to join us, to unify the Baratheon cause. You've refused. Stannis is named king. If you will not accept, you commit treason." Renly scoffed. "Treason? Then call me traitor." He turned to the lords of the Reach, lifting his hands in a gesture of appeal. "Will you follow me, or bend to a man who has no warmth, no mercy? A man who would punish us for every slight, real or imagined?" A few of the Tyrell bannermen stirred, uncertain. Mace Tyrell was not present, having lingered outside the city, but several of his bannermen frowned at one another. Loras Tyrell stood beside Renly, gaze fixed, lips set in determination. It was clear that the Tyrell Knights would not simply acquiesce to Stannis. In that moment, Tywin spoke, his voice carrying effortlessly. I, for one, have no love for men who brandish children as hostages. Are we certain we want such a protector who would hold the queen and her offspring in chains to secure a throne for Baratheon? If Lord Stark is so quick to brandish hostages, what will King Stannis do to the families who defied him? A spark of fury went through Ned. He stepped forward, locking eyes with Tywin. Would you call yourself an innocent in the matter of hostages, my lord? You were the one who had Elia Martell's children killed, who destroyed House Rain and Tarbeck. Do not stand there and feign moral outrage. Tywin's cheeks went taut. I will do what is necessary to protect my family. You do the same, I see. He shifted his gaze to the hall. We all do. So let us speak clearly. If this is the realm's decision, House Lannister withholds its support until its children are returned safely. If that does not happen, we will ride out. And once we are free of your city, Lord Stark, you cannot stop us from exacting vengeance for what you have done. A hush rippled through the assembled lords, for Tywin's words were a direct threat of war if the hostages were not released. Renly seized on it. You see, the moment we fix a crown on Stannis' head, Tywin will raise the West, and the realm burns. I can woo House Lannister more gently. Stannis barked a harsh laugh. If you think you can convince Tywin to accept your reign, you're a fool. He'll accept no king but Joffrey, or none at all. Ned cleared his throat, forcing the tension down. We have made the declaration. Stannis Baratheon is the rightful king. If there are dissenters, let them leave King's Landing now, provided they do not attempt to free prisoners or cause harm. You will be granted safe passage. Those words rang like a thunderclap. Some lords who had been teetering on the fence exchanged urgent whispers. Renly's face hardened. Safe passage is one thing, but if I leave, you can be sure I'll return with an army. Do you truly want that, Ned? We could have joined forces. Stannis shook his head, unwavering. There is one king. If you turn away from me, you turn away from the law. Renly's hands curled into fists. For a heartbeat, Ned feared he might draw steel right there, that the throne room would erupt in blood. But Renly exhaled, forced a thin smile, and turned on his heel. You have made your choice, Lord Stark. I hope your king is everything you wish him to be. He motioned to Loras and the other Reach bannermen. Together, they swept out of the hall. Tywin watched them go. Then he, too, inclined his head ironically to Ned. So be it. House Lannister will depart the city. If you try to stop us, we will see how well your gold cloaks fare against our swords. And if any harm comes to my grandchildren, I will make sure your line ends with you, Stark. Ned tensed. He had no intention of letting Tywin walk out with an army, but forcibly detaining him in the city could spark the very war Ned hoped to avoid. And if Tywin was set on leaving, attempts to block him might unleash bloodshed in the streets. For a moment, Ned was paralyzed by the implications. Stannis broke the silence. You will remain here until I decide otherwise, Lord Tywin. If you leave, you must do so without armed force. Let your men remain camped outside if you wish, but you cannot sally forth unimpeded. Tywin's gaze slid to Stannis with open contempt. You presume to command me, now that you've had your name spoken over an empty chair? Very well, but do not expect me to kneel. I want to see my grandchildren, if only to confirm they yet live. Stannis glanced at Ned, uncertain. Ned nodded. You may see them, but under guard. Tywin said nothing, but the tightness around his eyes told Ned he burned for retribution. He beckoned Cersei and Tyrion, and the three Lannisters swept from the hall, gold cloaks moving to escort them. The tension in the throne room simmered even as they departed. Ned looked around, saw the swirling mixture of fear, triumph, and unease among the lords who remained. Edmure Tully approached, worry etched on his face. My lord, what of the Riverlands? If Tywin's men are permitted to remain near the city, my home remains threatened. I beg King Stannis to take swift action. Stannis raised his chin. I will protect the Riverlands. House Tully was loyal to my brother. They shall have the crown's protection. Oberin Martell stepped forward, curiosity in his dark eyes. And what of Dorne? Will the king address our grievances against House Lannister? Gregor Clegane still breathes, last I heard. The blood of Elia Martell is unavenged. Stannis's brow furrowed. We will address all crimes in due time. I do not forget what happened to Elia. Once Tywin is made to bend the knee, justice will be served. Oberin inclined his head. A promising statement. I will remain in King's Landing to see it fulfilled. Pray do not disappoint me. With that, the hall began to empty. Stannis stood at the foot of the Iron Throne, a swirl of conflicting emotions on his stern features. He turned to Ned. We will need a coronation ceremony soon, a symbol to the realm that the throne is no longer vacant. We must also secure the cooperation of the faith. If the High Septon endorses me, it might calm some nerves. Ned agreed. I'll speak with him, but the real problem is the armies outside the city. Renly to the south, Tywin to the west. We can't fight them both at once. Stannis nodded grimly. We'll find a way. Thank you, Lord Stark, for your loyalty. Once I am crowned, I will name you Hand of the King. Permanently this time, if you'll accept. Ned's heart constricted. He felt the old guilt stirring again. But he bowed. I'll serve, though I beg you, let us strive for a peaceful settlement if it's at all possible. Stannis grimaced. I doubt peace is possible with the likes of Tywin, but I'll consider your counsel. They parted ways. Ned, physically exhausted, emotionally drained, made his way through the labyrinth of corridors until he found the small sept in the Red Keep, where he sometimes went to gather his thoughts. He was not a devotee of the Seven, preferring the old gods, but the quiet hush of the sept offered a rare solace. He sank to one knee at the altar, letting the flickering candles wash over him. He prayed silently, though not in the southern manner. He prayed to the old gods, remembering the face of the heart tree in Winterfell's godswood, the weirwood's red leaves and solemn features. He prayed for the strength to see his family safe. He prayed for no more innocent blood. He prayed for wisdom in the face of so many perils. And above all, he prayed that somewhere in the swirl of cunning and cruelty, he had not lost his soul entirely. When he rose, he felt a flicker of renewed resolve. He had named Stannis king. That was the core truth the realm needed. If Tywin or Renly chose war, Ned would do what he must. He would hold the Lannister children as long as necessary, even if it cut him to do so. Tywin might threaten to raise the north, but Ned had Robb and his bannermen preparing. Renly might gather the Reach, but the gold cloaks and the city walls would make a siege costly. Perhaps the coming weeks would give them all a chance to see reason. As he left the sept, the corridors were oddly still. A pair of gold cloaks saluted him, but otherwise the Red Keep felt drained, as though the day's events had sapped its spirit. Yet in the hidden passages, the hush concealed countless whispers and conspiracies. Varys's little birds flitted behind walls. Littlefinger's informants traded coin for secrets. Tyrion might be meeting with pawns of his own. Cersei would be telling her father everything she could glean. The game continued without respite. Ned realized, with a pang, that the next step was to face Tywin's request to see the children. He had granted that audience, and it had to be done carefully, with guards aplenty, ensuring Tywin could not whisk them away or coax them into a plot. Ned steeled himself for another clash with the Old Lion. He ordered a retinue of 20 men, all personally loyal to House Stark, to escort Tywin from his chambers to the Tower of the Hand where Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were kept. Word came that Tywin waited in the main courtyard. Ned went to meet him, flanked by Tommard Castle and other steadfast men. Tywin stood with Cersei, Tyrion, and a handful of Lannister guards. The atmosphere crackled with tension, each side measuring the other. Ned led them inside, down the corridors, speaking little. Cersei's eyes flicked around, likely noting the double layers of guard detail. Tyrion ambled with a faint limp, his keen gaze missing nothing. Tywin marched at the head of his group, silent as a statue, his face unreadable. At last, they arrived at the Tower of the Hand. Ned gestured for several guards to stand aside, but only enough to let Tywin and his immediate kin pass. No more than 3 Lannister men enter, Ned said, voice firm. The rest remain here. Tywin eyed him coldly. Agreed. He turned to his guards, choosing 2. Cersei went with him, Tyrion followed. They climbed the winding staircase to the level where the children were quartered. At the door, another half-dozen Stark men parted with obvious reluctance, letting the visitors through. Ned and 4 of his own loyal guards accompanied them inside. The sight of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen in the modest but comfortable quarters made Ned's stomach twist. Myrcella perked up at once when she saw her grandfather, though her gaze flickered anxiously toward Ned and the men in armor. Tommen's eyes welled with tears of relief, and he ran to Cersei, burying his face in her skirt. Joffrey remained standing at the window, arms folded, scowling. Tywin stepped forward, the slightest softening crossing his visage as he regarded his grandchildren. "You are well?" he asked, and Myrcella nodded. Tommen sniffled. Joffrey said nothing, lips pressed tight. Cersei knelt, hugging Tommen, brushing her fingers through Myrcella's hair. She murmured quiet reassurances. Then her gaze snapped to Ned. "You see how they suffer?" she demanded. "Their children, robbed of their freedom. Does that not shame you?" Before Ned could answer, Tywin said, "At least they remain unharmed. I will concede that you have not stooped to the methods of lesser men. Still, it is unconscionable that you keep them as prisoners. Release them to me." Ned stood firm. "I cannot, my lord. Not until we have certain assurances you will not use them as a shield for your own ambitions. You swore to raise arms if I continued holding them, so you give me no choice." Tommen looked up from his mother's embrace, blinking. "Please, Lord Stark," he said in a small voice. "I want to go home." Ned's heart ached, but he forced his voice steady. "I'm sorry, Tommen. Not yet." Joffrey turned then, eyes smoldering. "We should kill you," he hissed. "Grandfather, why do you let him speak to us so? He's no true king. He's just a traitor with swords." Tywin glanced at Joffrey, then back at Ned. "This predicament is your doing, Stark. If you had acted with more wisdom..." Cersei cut in. "This is pointless. You have your illusions of power, but you won't hold onto them for long. My father will not rest, and someday you will pay for this." Ned sighed. "Then we are finished here." Tywin lingered a moment, letting his gaze roam over Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. There was something akin to regret in his eyes, though overshadowed by anger. He turned to Ned. "They had better remain safe. If one hair on their heads is harmed..." Ned's voice turned as cold as the northern wind. "I won't harm children, Lord Tywin, so long as you do not force my hand. But if you or your men attempt any rescue, or if you put my own children at risk, I will do what I must. Do you understand me?" Tywin said nothing, merely inclined his head. He gestured for Cersei and Tyrion to leave, pressing one last comforting touch to Myrcella's shoulder before stepping back. The door opened, and they filed out under the watchful eyes of Ned's guards. Joffrey remained at the window, not even sparing his grandfather a goodbye look, whether out of resentment or teenage pride. Down the stairs they went, the Lannisters flanked by Stark men. Tyrion studied Ned in silence, as if searching for cracks in this new persona. Cersei walked stiff and proud, one hand still on Tommen's shoulder as if refusing to let him go, until 2 guards stepped in front of her to halt her. She had to relinquish him. The boy's lip trembled, and Cersei kissed his forehead. Then she let him step back into his guarded quarters. Once in the corridor, Tywin's anger radiated like heat from a forge, but he kept his composure. He turned to Ned at the foot of the tower stairs. "I trust you realize you've sown the seeds of a war that may outlast us both." Ned met his gaze. "Perhaps, but maybe this is also the only way to prevent it from consuming the entire realm. I hope you see reason before it comes to open battle, my lord." Tywin offered no reply. With that, the uneasy procession continued down to the courtyard, where Tywin's men rejoined him. They left the Red Keep, heading for their camp outside the walls, under the watch of gold cloaks. As Ned stood at the gates, watching them go, He could almost taste the fury rolling off Tywin. A confrontation seemed inevitable. In the days that followed, King Stannis began to assert authority. He held court in the Red Keep, hearing petitions from lesser lords, reaffirming loyalties, and installing men of his choosing into key positions. Ned, as promised, was named Hand of the King. Davos Seaworth took on the role of Master of Ships. Ser Barristan remained Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, though the Kingsguard itself was in disarray. Only a few knights remained to swear to Stannis, the rest having fled or been dismissed after showing loyalty to Joffrey. Stannis also summoned the High Septon to perform a coronation ceremony in the Great September of Baelor. Ned noticed the throngs of small folk crowding the streets, many of them uncertain whether to cheer or remain silent. The tension weighed heavily on the city. Some, hearing stories of Stannis's stern justice, murmured that a new tyranny had arrived. Others, recalling Robert's memory, decided at least it was the rightful lineage. A hush fell on the city when Stannis knelt before the High Septon and was crowned with a circlet of black iron and gold. He rose, declared himself the true Baratheon king, and promised to defend the realm against all threats, within or without. Ned stood at Stannis' side, clad in somber gray, the direwolf of House Stark pinned at his collar. He looked out at the masked lords and knights, scanning their faces. Renly did not attend, having left the city with his core supporters. Tywin also was conspicuously absent, though a few Lannister bannermen hovered, uncertain. Oberin Martell leaned in a corner, watching with guarded interest. The Tully representatives stood with Ned, but Edmure's face was dark with worry. When the ceremony concluded, King Stannis emerged to a mixture of subdued cheers and sullen stares. He marched back to the Red Keep as if determined to begin ruling immediately. Over the next few days, ravens flew out bearing the royal decree. Joffrey Baratheon was disinherited, declared a bastard born of incest, Myrcella and Tommen likewise. Any who supported the false claim would be considered traitors. Renly Baratheon was invited to lay down his ambitions and bend the knee, or face the same fate. Tywin Lannister was ordered to present himself and bend the knee in recognition of the new king. His grandchildren would be returned to him once he complied. The realm, predictably, fractured. Some lords who despised Tywin or doubted Joffrey's parentage flocked to Stannis' banner. Others, especially in the west, held firm to the Lannisters. The Tyrells hovered near Renly, who called for a gathering of southern lords to defend the realm from Stannis' tyranny. The Riverlands, battered by skirmishes, tentatively clung to the new king, hoping for relief from Lannister raids. Dorne, unpredictable as ever, remained outwardly neutral, though Oberin's presence suggested they might soon negotiate with the new crown for their long-delayed vengeance against the Lannisters. One afternoon, Ned stood on the battlements of the Red Keep, gazing westward across the Blackwater Rush, where the Lannister and Baratheon camps sat in tense watch of one another. King Stannis had demanded that Tywin move his forces farther away from the city. Tywin refused, claiming he had every right to camp where he willed until his kin were freed. So a stalemate formed, two armies, side by side, glaring at each other, neither wanting to strike first for fear of losing the children or igniting a bloodbath they were unprepared to finish. It gave Ned time to fortify, time to send messages north, time to pray that Robb Stark and the Northern Bannermen might reinforce King's Landing if war ignited. He also had time to dwell on the moral cost of his choices. Each day, he revisited the Tower of the Hand, ensuring the Lannister children were comfortable, that they were fed and safe. Each day, he saw how Joffrey's hatred festered, how Tommen grew more anxious, how Myrcella retreated into a polite shell of forced calm. He tried to speak gently to them, but they would not see him as anything but a jailer. Sansa sometimes visited Myrcella, and the two girls would talk softly of simpler things. Dresses, music, life at court. Arya refused to visit, caring little for Joffrey after all he had done. She spent her days training with Syrio or shadowing the corridors, occasionally vanishing into the city to explore with the curiosity of a cat. Ned worried about her, but she always returned, breathless with new discoveries about the hidden corners of King's Landing. As the standoff dragged on, Rumors circulated that Renly had traveled to Highgarden, forging an unbreakable alliance with Mace Tyrell. Ned anticipated that Renly would eventually march on King's Landing, hoping to strike while Stannis was pinned by Tywin's presence. If that happened, the city could face a two-front threat. Unless, of course, Tywin decided to make common cause with Renly to depose Stannis, exchanging the children's safety as part of a secret agreement. The possibilities churned Ned's stomach, reminding him constantly that he had stepped onto a path of ruthless strategy. Now, at every turn, new perils threatened. One evening, word reached Ned that a skirmish had erupted between Tywin's men and a small group of Baratheon knights outside the city. The details were sketchy. Some said the knights had been foraging too close to Tywin's lines. Others claimed Tywin's men had instigated it to test the Baratheon's strength. Several men died on each side. That night, Ned summoned both Tywin's envoys and Stannis' captains to the Great Hall, demanding an explanation. Arguments flared, accusations flew, and in the end, no resolution was reached beyond a vow from both sides to restrain their men. But violence had already spilled. The precarious peace was beginning to crumble. King Stannis, impatient with Tywin's defiance and Renly's growing threat, confided in Ned that he wished to bring the fight to them both. "We should strike now," Stannis growled, pacing around the table where a map of the Crownlands lay spread. "I have enough men to attack Tywin's camp, take him unawares. If I capture or kill Tywin, the West will fall in line quickly, the children be damned. Once that's done, I can turn south and handle Renly." Ned resisted. "If we slaughter Tywin's men, he'll order his forces in the west to ravage the Riverlands. The Tullys are already on the edge of ruin. And what of the children? He might stop caring for their lives if he thinks them doomed. We risk them dying in the crossfire." Stannis' dark gaze flicked to Ned. "I understand your reservations, but how long can we wait? The longer we delay, the stronger Renly grows. And Tywin's presence is a threat. I would rid myself of him." Ned set his jaw. "We can hold this stalemate, Your Grace. We have the city's defenses, the gold cloaks, and soon Robb Stark's army from the north will bolster us. Give me time to coordinate with the Tullys. Perhaps we can encircle Tywin and force him to surrender, without a reckless battle that spills innocent blood." Stannis frowned, frustration etched in every line of his face. "Very well, but do not think my patience is endless. I am king now, and a king must act." Ned bowed his head. "I will not forget." In the days that followed, Ned redoubled his efforts at diplomacy. He sent ravens to Riverrun, urging Edmure and the Blackfish to harry Lannister's supply lines, perhaps pressuring Tywin into negotiation. He dispatched envoys to Dorne, inviting them to form a pact with King Stannis in exchange for justice against the Lannisters. He even tried to open channels to the Vale, though Lysa's paranoid isolationism continued to thwart him. Meanwhile, the children in the tower remained a potent lever, but each day they stayed captive tightened the knot of moral compromise in Ned's heart. Cersei was confined to the Red Keep, allowed supervised freedom in certain corridors and courtyards, but no more. She made repeated attempts to bribe or seduce guards, or to dispatch coded letters. Each time, Ned's watchers intercepted her efforts, bringing the letters to him. The Queen's fury grew, her eyes red with sleepless malice. "This city will fall," she told him once in a corridor. "You may think you're safe, but you're not." Ned answered quietly, "Your children will remain safe so long as you do not push me. If Tywin or your brother Jaime attempts anything, they risk your children's lives. I'd rather not see that happen." Cersei hissed. "And what of your own children? They are hardly out of harm's reach if war comes." Ned forced himself not to rise to the threat. Sansa and Arya, at least, were under his eye in King's Landing, though that brought dangers of its own. Robb, Bran, and Rickon were far away in Winterfell. He had to trust that the North would protect them. "We all risk something, my lady," he said, "but you have lost this game. Only pride keeps you from admitting it." Cersei laughed coldly, turning away. "We'll see, Lord Stark. We shall see." So the days wore on, with small skirmishes and no outright war. 1,000 petty intrigues blossomed in the city's hidden corners, swirling around the new king's uncertain reign, the captive Lannisters, and the lurking approach of Renly's host in the south. Every dawn, Ned woke with the same question burning in his mind. How long until the storm broke? He got his answer on a crisp morning a fortnight after Stannis' coronation. A scout from Rosby galloped into the city, dust-choked and wild-eyed, reporting that a column of Tyrell banners had been spotted marching north toward King's Landing. Renly Baratheon rode at their head. Tens of thousands, if the rumors were true, more than Stannis' current forces. The day Ned had feared, when the city might face a combined assault from Renly's southern approach and Tywin's western camp, could be at hand. King Stannis met Ned in the courtyard, the wind whipping their cloaks about, the sky overhead threatening rain. Soldiers bustled, gold cloaks readied at the gates. "So it's begun," Stannis said, eyes grim. "Renly comes. Tywin remains. We are beset on two sides." Ned felt the old weight settle on his shoulders. "We can still use the city's defenses. We have enough men to man the walls, and the Lannister children keep Tywin from launching a full assault. But Renly's approach complicates that. He might force Tywin's hand. If they coordinate, they could break our lines." Stannis bared his teeth in a humorless smile. "Then we must strike first. I'm tired of waiting. Tonight, we ride out with what force we can muster and shatter Tywin's camp. If we destroy his army, Renly will think twice about attacking. Or if he does, we'll have only one enemy to face." Ned's stomach churned. "If you attack Tywin's camp, they might kill the children out of spite. Or Tywin might send men into the city to free them while our forces are outside the walls." Stannis turned, eyes blazing. "Then we guard them better. We can't let fear of harming the hostages paralyze us. I want this done, Ned, and I am king." Ned swallowed, remembering how Robert had once commanded him to do distasteful things in war. He had not always agreed, but Stannis was right that the net tightened. War was coming, and the only question was who struck first. "Give me until sunset," Ned said. "Let me fortify the city and plan for any infiltration. Then if you must ride out, I will support you. But we must be cautious." Stannis inclined his head, though impatience flickered in his eyes. "Sunset, then." Ned immediately set about preparations. He ordered an increased watch on the Tower of the Hand, posted archers on the rooftops near it, filled the corridors with loyal men. He dispatched a squad to shadow Tywin's men in the city, ensuring none could slip out or in unnoticed. The gold cloaks were mustered along the walls, the gates shut to anyone who could not prove their identity. Through it all, Sansa and Arya watched their father's anxious commands, unsure of how to help. Sansa offered to pray in the castle sept, while Arya, in typical fashion, demanded to fight. Ned told her gently but firmly that her place was to remain hidden and safe. "I cannot lose you, too," he said. Sunset came all too quickly. The sky reddened like spilled wine over the battlements. King Stannis gathered his knights and soldiers in the courtyard, the sound of hooves and armor reverberating. Torches flared in the deepening twilight. Ned stood at the gates, wearing his own armor beneath a fur-trimmed cloak, a sword at his side. Ice, too large for mounted combat, was left in the keep. The plan was to surprise Tywin's camp under cover of darkness, hoping to rout them before they could rally. Just as Ned prepared to mount his horse, a horn's call shattered the air. A second blast followed, echoing across the city. Men on the walls shouted, pointing west. In the dying light, pennants flickered atop lances and spears. Another army was approaching, this one from the Gold Road. A swirl of confusion seized the yard. Some of Stannis' men thought Tywin was attacking. Others feared a pincer movement. Ned rushed to the battlements, peering into the gloom. Then a voice cried out, "It's the Wolf's banner!" Ned's heart soared. There, amid the swirling dust of the roads, the gray direwolf of House Stark rippled on a sea of northern banners. His son Robb had arrived. He rode at the head of a host, flanked by lords from the north. Bolton's men, Umbers, Karstarks, Manderleys, thousands strong. Ned's chest clenched with a mingling of relief and alarm. If Robb had marched so far south, had he left the north vulnerable? Or had he come just in time to tip the balance? And how would Stannis react to a large northern army entering the fray? He hurried down to meet them at the gate, motioning the gold cloaks to stand aside. The portcullis rose, and in thundered the vanguard. Dust swirled, horses snorting, northern men gazing warily at the city they'd heard so many foul rumors about. Then Robb Stark himself rode through, taller than Ned remembered, his jaw set, eyes bright with determination. As soon as he saw Ned, he swung down from his saddle, and Ned rushed forward to clasp him in a fierce embrace. "Father," Robb said, voice choked with emotion. "I came as soon as we could muster. You said you needed our swords, and by the gods, I hope we're not too late." Ned pulled back, taking in his son's face. There was youth there still, but also a hardness that came from commanding an army. "You arrived at the perfect moment. The realm stands on the brink of war. Stannis is king, Tywin is camped outside, and Renly marches from the south." Robb nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "We'll stand with you, father." The north answers House Stark's call. The yard erupted with a clamor of greetings, men dismounting, stable hands rushing to tend the horses. King Stannis approached, looking Robb up and down with cool appraisal. "Young Stark," Stannis said, "you've come a long way for a fight that may be upon us tonight." Robb bowed. "I pledge the north to King Stannis, if my father so commands. We stand for the lawful king." Stannis's jaw relaxed slightly. "We do need your men," he admitted. "We ride to strike Tywin's camp as soon as we confirm your readiness." Robb's brow lifted. "A night attack? Then let us not waste time. My men are tired from the road, but they'll fight if it must be done." "Is that the plan, father?" Ned felt the swirl of conflicting emotions. The pride that Robb had grown into a leader, the terror that he was about to lead his son into a desperate battle. Still, the tide of events rushed them forward. "Yes," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Stannis wants to break Tywin. With the North's arrival, we might have the numbers to do it decisively. But we must coordinate carefully." Stannis's command staff joined them, huddling around flickering torches and a hastily unrolled map. They plotted the routes by which Robb's cavalry and foot could surround Tywin's flank, how Stannis's knights might spear through the center, how the gold cloaks might hold the city gates in case of a counterstrike. The plan was risk-laden, but time was short. Already, word would be spreading through Tywin's camp that a northern host had arrived. If they hesitated, Tywin might move first, or Renly might appear unexpectedly from the south. Ned found himself glancing at the Tower of the Hand, thinking of the Lannister children. If a battle erupted, how safe would they be? He ordered Tomard Castle to remain with a sizable guard to protect them. He also left a message for Sansa and Arya, telling them to remain in the Red Keep under guard until the danger passed. Finally, under the moon's pale glow, King Stannis and Robb Stark led their combined force out of the city gates. Ned rode near them, heart pounding, the banner of the crowned stag flying beside the direwolf. Torches bobbed in the darkness, armor rattled, horses snorted. From the ramparts, thousands of eyes watched the columns move out. Tywin's camp lay just beyond a gentle rise, a scattering of tents and wooden palisades to the west. Scouts reported that the Lannisters were on high alert, but not fully prepared for a coordinated assault by a suddenly reinforced enemy. The plan was for a pincer, Stannis leading the main body from the front, Robb swinging around to strike the flank, the gold cloaks holding the approach back to the city. Ned swallowed his fear, remembering the smell of blood from past battles. He told himself, this is the price of being ruthless, of trying to outmaneuver Tywin on his own terms. They advanced, hooves muffled by the damp ground, the hush so deep that Ned could hear his own heartbeat. Closer, closer to the ring of watchfires that encircled Tywin's positions. The watchers might see them at any moment, sounding the alarm. Robb's cavalry vanished into the darkness on the flank. Ned rode with Stannis, scanning the silhouettes of tents and men. For an instant, Time seemed suspended, as if the gods themselves paused to see if blood would be spilled. Then a shout rang out. Horns blared. Lights flared as men rushed for spears and swords. The pounding of hooves erupted as Stannis bellowed, "Charge!" Ned spurred his horse forward, sword in hand, feeling the thunderous surge of men behind him. Torches lit the night, revealing the wide-eyed faces of Lannister sentries scrambling to form a line. Shouts tangled with screams as the wave of Baratheon and Stark men crashed into the outer perimeter. The clash of steel on steel rang through the darkness. Ned parried a spear thrust, then slashed at a Lannister guard, toppling him. He glimpsed Stannis on the front line, cutting down foes with grim efficiency. Chaos consumed the night. Fire sprang up in places where tents were torched. The ground churned under the hooves of warring cavalry. Men yelling commands lost in the din. Arrows whistled overhead. Ned pressed inward, searching for Tywin's banner, the Golden Lion. He saw it near the center, guarded by knights in heavy plate. The swirl of battle carried him left, then right, then left again, never quite able to break through. At one point, he heard a great war cry and saw Robb Stark's cavalry slam into the Lannister flank, scattering archers and outriders. Robb himself, the wind whipping his hair, led a wedge that carved deep into the heart of the camp, forging a corridor of death. Ned's heart lifted at the sight, a spark of desperate hope igniting. If they could trap Tywin's corps, then the Lannisters rallied. Their knights regrouped, forming a solid block that repelled the next wave of attackers. Ned heard men screaming as swords bit flesh, smelled the acrid stench of smoke and blood. He fought to keep a coherent sense of the battlefield, urging men forward where he saw gaps. "Hold formation!" he roared to a knot of gold cloaks surging behind him. "Regroup on me!" And so the night raged on, lit by flickering fires, the sky overhead a black dome pricked by cold stars. The ground grew slick with mud and gore. Men stumbled over bodies, swords slipping from numb fingers. Horses reared and screamed. Ned took a cut on his left arm, ignoring the pain as he slashed back at the assailant. He risked a glance around. He saw Stannis's banner weaving amid the melee, the king still pressing forward. He saw Robb's direwolf banner dancing near the center, fighting fiercely. Somewhere, Tywin Lannister directed his men. Ned could not see the old lion, but he felt the force of Tywin's presence in the disciplined resistance. If they could force Tywin to yield, to surrender, Ned might end this in a single stroke. But if Tywin escaped, the war would go on. A sudden rally of Lannister knights pushed Ned's group back. He staggered, nearly losing his balance in the churned muck. A horse reared, flailing hooves passing inches from his face. He ducked, hammered his sword into a gap in the knight's armor. The knight toppled, screaming. Ned pressed on, side by side with Tomard Castle, who had joined the fight after securing the city watch. They carved a path through the chaos. Then Ned saw it, the Golden Lion banner dipping, as though carried away in retreat. A swirl of Lannister men followed, streaming west through the wreckage of their own camp, pursued by pockets of Baratheon and Stark cavalry. Panic was spreading among Tywin's ranks. He heard a horn blast from the left flank, Stannis' signal to regroup, perhaps to encircle the fleeing Lannisters. Ned urged his horse toward the sound, adrenaline pounding in his ears. All around, the night wore on with savage intensity. Bodies littered the ground. He passed wounded men groaning in the dirt, some crying for their mothers, some cursing their lords for leading them here. A cluster of Lannister knights blocked Ned's way, bristling with spears. He reined in, blood pounding, the taste of metal in his mouth. Before they could charge him, a roar split the air. Gray Wind, Robb's direwolf, thundered out of the darkness, eyes glowing red in the firelight. The beast lunged at the knights, sowing terror. Robb himself followed, hacking down a spearman. The line broke, men scattering, and Ned seized the chance to push through. "Father!" Robb gasped, reining up beside him. Blood spattered his armor, his face white with shock and exertion. "We're winning. Their lines are collapsing." Ned nodded, panting. "We must find Tywin. He won't yield easily." Together they pressed onward. The main wedge of Lannister resistance was in tatters, scattering westward. Stannis' knights closed from the other side. The noose was tightening. Then, as Ned climbed a slight rise in the ground, he saw a mounted figure in gilt armor rallying a last group of men. Tywin Lannister himself, his voice cutting through the din, urging his guard to hold a passage for him to escape. Ned raised his sword, adrenaline surging anew. "There! We take him now!" With Robb at his side, Ned led a rush down toward Tywin's position. Tywin's guard turned, some brandishing longswords, others couched lances. Ned braced for impact. Steel met steel in a furious clash. Ned's sword rang off a shield. Robb struck down a lancer. A Lannister knight hammered at Ned, almost knocking him from the saddle. But Ned fought back fiercely, fueled by months of pent-up resolve. Amid the swirl, Tywin tried to withdraw, spurring his warhorse, but the press of bodies slowed him. His eyes met Ned's for an instant, cold and implacable. A spear from a Baratheon soldier nearly unhorsed him. Tywin slashed down, cutting the man's throat, but in that moment, Robb surged forward, sword raised, blocking Tywin's path. "Yield!" Robb shouted. "Yield, Lord Lannister!" Tywin's lips curled in a snarl. He wheeled his horse around, searching for a gap. Ned struck at one of Tywin's guards, sending the man crashing to the ground. Another guard lunged at Robb, glancing a blow off his shield. Tywin attempted to spur through a gap, but more Stark men flooded in, cutting him off. Ned wrenched his horse beside Tywin's, leveling his sword. "It's over, Tywin. Call your men off." For a heartbeat, Tywin glared at Ned with pure hatred, as though weighing whether to fight to the death or swallow his pride. He saw his men cut down, saw that there was no path out. Slowly, he raised a hand, signaling the guard to halt. The pounding of battle around them began to ebb, as if the swirling violence realized the central figure was contained. Tywin Lannister exhaled heavily, his shoulders rigid with anger. "I yield," he spat, the words sounding like a curse. A hush descended over the patch of battlefield. Men on both sides looked on, bloodied, exhausted. Robb held his sword at the ready, breathing hard. Ned felt a wave of relief so powerful it threatened to unman him. Tywin had surrendered. The lion was caged. Stannis arrived moments later, dismounting in a swirl of cloak. He took in the scene. Tywin, battered, his guard decimated, Ned and Robb holding him at sword point. A flicker of triumph crossed the new king's face. "Lord Lannister," Stannis said, "you will order your men to lay down arms immediately, or I will have you executed for treason." Tywin's gaze flicked from Stannis to Ned. "And my family?" Ned did not lower his sword. "Your grandchildren remain safe in King's Landing. They will stay that way as long as you keep your word." Tywin bared his teeth in a parody of a smile, then turned to one of his remaining knights. "Signal the retreat," he growled. "We yield." So the horns sounded again, carrying the message across the smoldering remains of Tywin's camp. Lannister men began to drop weapons or flee in disorganized clumps. Stannis' forces fanned out, taking prisoners, stamping out fires, searching for any pockets of resistance. The dawn's light would reveal a field littered with the dead and dying, but the critical blow had been struck. Tywin Lannister, the fearsome lion who had terrorized the realm for decades, was now a prisoner of the crown he had once sought to manipulate. Ned sat atop his horse, blood drying on his arm, adrenaline still thrumming in his veins. Robb dismounted, helping the wounded. Stannis barked orders for men to collect the survivors, to see them properly disarmed and chained if need be. Some part of Ned wanted to sink to his knees and weep for the horror of it. But the new, ruthless part of him reminded him there was yet more to do. Renly's army still approached from the south. The realm might still shatter if they did not move swiftly. He dismounted, walking toward Tywin, who had been pulled off his horse and stood surrounded by a ring of swords. The old lion's pride was battered but not broken. He met Ned's gaze with smoldering resentment. Remember this moment, Stark. Remember that you have chosen to cross House Lannister in the most unforgivable way. Ned held Tywin's stare. Threatening me won't free you, nor will it free your grandchildren. I told you that you'd forced my hand. This is how it ends. Tywin said nothing more. 2 Baratheon knights seized him, binding his hands. The night's wind carried the scent of blood, the crackle of distant fires, the low moans of wounded men. Ned turned away, unable to meet Tywin's glare any longer. He found Robb kneeling by a fallen Stark bannerman, a man from White Harbor. Blood trickled from the man's mouth, and Robb tried to stanch a wound in his side. Ned joined them, pressing his hand over the wound with all the gentleness he could manage. The soldier's eyes flicked open, recognized them, and closed again, life slipping away. Robb bit his lip, tears welling as he looked up at his father. Ned placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. You fought bravely. We must tend to our fallen and our wounded, then see to the next challenge. Robb nodded, grief etched across his young features. Yes, father. In the distance, King Stannis' banner flapped in the smoky air. The battle had been won, but the war was not done. Renly's host loomed, and who knew what schemes still brewed in King's Landing or beyond. But for this moment, Ned allowed himself a weary sense of accomplishment. He had met Tywin Lannister with Tywin's own methods, ruthless strategy, hostages, alliances, and he had prevailed. Somewhere, in a hidden corner of his mind, he wondered if the price was too high, if he had lost something essential of Eddard Stark along the way. But as he gazed at Robb, at the men who now looked to them for leadership and survival, he knew there was no turning back. The realm demanded resolution. He would press on, step by step, forging a fragile future from the shattered pieces of war. If that meant continuing to walk the path of the wolf in the lion's mane, so be it. The dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale light on the battlefield. Ned rose from the side of the fallen bannerman, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. A new day had come, and with it, a new stage in the ever-shifting Game of Thrones. He stood amid the carnage, silent prayers for the dead on his lips, as the realm drew one breath closer to an uneasy peace, or to fresh storms that waited just beyond the southern horizon, where Renly Baratheon's banners now gathered like a thundercloud, ready to break. The aftermath of Tywin Lannister's capture unfolded in the first light of dawn. The battlefield west of King's Landing lay thick with the dead and dying, the wounded calling out for comrades or the mercy of a quick end. A pall of smoke drifted across the churned mud where tents had been set ablaze. Ned Stark breathed in the acrid stench as he and his son Robb oversaw the grim tasks that followed any victory: tending the wounded, gathering prisoners, and accounting for the fallen. King Stannis moved among his knights, his expression carved from stone, issuing commands in a clipped, cold voice that brooked no hesitation. Ned caught only scattered glimpses of the man who had once commanded awe across the Seven Kingdoms. Tywin Lannister was now a prisoner, stripped of his gilded armor, his arms bound behind him. His hair had come loose from its careful grooming during the battle. A gash on his forehead bled sluggishly. Dried blood streaked his temple and jaw. Yet even in this humiliating state, he stood with his back unbowed, his lips pressed into a tight line. From time to time, his eyes flicked over to where Ned directed the cleanup of the battlefield, as though memorizing every face that lent the Starks and Baratheons support. Robb Stark knelt beside another of his fallen men, pressing a hand to the man's chest in wordless farewell. When he rose, his cheeks were grimy with soot and tears. His eyes had lost something of their youthful brightness in the span of a single night's engagement. Ned felt a deep ache at how fast the boy had been forced to harden. But this was war, and the realm spared no illusions. Father and son walked a short distance to a cluster of Stark and Baratheon banners, where King Stannis held an impromptu war council on the charred remains of a Lannister pavilion. The ground beneath them squelched with each step. Several key lords stood around the king, among them Davos Seaworth, who had fought bravely at Stannis' side, and a few Stark bannermen, Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, and Wyman Manderly among them. These men had marched south with Robb, and now they found themselves in the thick of southern conflict. Stannis turned sharply as Ned and Robb approached, his face a mask of determination and exhaustion. "Lord Stark," he said, sparing a moment for a curt nod. "Your son arrived at a most opportune time. Had we not possessed this sudden influx of northern strength, we might have lost more men, or found Tywin beyond our grasp." "We are glad to have helped," Ned replied, unable to summon any trace of triumph. So many corpses lay strewn across the field, and the realm was not yet at peace. "It will be a lasting blow to House Lannister that we've captured Lord Tywin alive." Stannis' gaze flicked over the field. "Aye, let him rot in a cell until I decide his fate. And now we must turn our attention to Renly. Scouts say his host draws closer by the day, and it's no small band of swords." Ned nodded. Word was that Renly forged a deeper alliance with Highgarden. If the Tyrells are truly marching, they could number well into the tens of thousands. Robb cleared his throat, standing a little straighter. "My lords, the men of the north are weary from the road and from this battle, but we are at your disposal. We'll stand with King Stannis, no matter what comes." Stannis acknowledged the pledge with a stiff inclination of his head. "Good. We must be prepared. If Renly arrives to find Tywin broken, he may attempt to position himself as the savior of the realm. Or he may demand my abdication in favor of his claim. I have no intention of yielding." Ned exchanged a quick glance with his son. "My lord, allow me to suggest that we try negotiation first. We have Tywin as a prisoner. We still hold the Lannister children in King's Landing. Renly has not yet committed himself to bloodshed against you. He's marched, yes, but perhaps we can turn him around with the proper leverage." A scornful twist marred Stannis' mouth. "I am no green boy to be swayed by illusions of peace where there is none. Renly marched on my rightful throne. Even if we force a negotiation, I doubt he'd yield. He'll want the crown for himself or, at the very least, humiliating concessions." Lord Roose Bolton cut in, his voice soft and cool. "Then best to break his host before it can entrench outside the city. A sudden stroke while they're on the march. Their supply lines might be vulnerable in the reach." "That is an option," Stannis allowed. "But my men are bloodied from this battle, and I'd need time to replenish supplies. We expended much. Renly likely knows that. If he's cunning, he'll move swiftly." Ned recognized the shape of an unwelcome reality. The realm teetered on the cusp of another savage confrontation, perhaps more devastating than the one they had just survived. Yet through it all, he clung to the knowledge that Tywin was no longer free to menace the Riverlands or threaten his own children's safety. That alone gave him cause to hope that, for once, the realm might see an end to Lannister aggression. Before they could discuss further, the conversation broke as a pair of Baratheon knights arrived, dragging a Lannister officer between them, bloodied, panting, eyes darting. "We caught this man trying to burn the supply wagons, your grace," one knight said, forcing the prisoner to his knees in the slick mud. "He claims Lord Tywin gave him orders to sabotage us if we prevailed." Stannis stared at the kneeling man. "Then he's guilty of treason, like the rest who followed Joffrey's false claim. Execute him. We'll have no more sabotage." Ned placed a hand on Stannis' arm, a bold move given Stannis' temper. "Your grace, perhaps we should show mercy. Let him yield and swear loyalty to the crown. We've shed enough blood for one day." Stannis' gaze hardened. "Mercy for a saboteur?" The prisoner looked up, trembling. "My lord, please. I was only following orders." Stannis' voice was cold steel. "It's always orders, isn't it? Davos, you know the law. Sabotage in wartime is punished by death." The Onion Knight's face pinched with regret. "Aye, your grace, that is the law. But Lord Stark makes a point. We may yet glean information from him, or at least show the realm we are not butchers." Ned could sense the conflict in Stannis. A man bound to the letter of law, yet aware that every action now shaped his tenuous reign. "For the sake of justice," Ned said quietly, "let him be questioned, then imprisoned. After we learn what we can, you may still carry out your sentence. But do not waste the chance that his knowledge might help us quell further acts of sabotage." Stannis exhaled. "Very well. question him, then lock him in chains. Once he's told us what he knows, I'll decide if he lives or dies." He gave the kneeling man a final glare before nodding for the knights to remove him. That small mercy was enough for Ned to keep hope that Stannis would not descend into tyranny. Still, the king's patience was thin as a thread, and the realm's patience with war might be even thinner. By noon, King Stannis ordered all able-bodied men to begin tearing down what was left of the Lannister camp for salvage. Wagons, tents, and stores. Prisoners had to be sorted. Those of rank might be held for ransom or forced to swear fealty, while common soldiers could face the choice of the Night's Watch or labor service. Tywin, though, was a special case. They guarded him with a score of knights at all times, refusing to let him out of sight. Ned, exhausted, wanted more than anything to ride back to King's Landing, see to Sansa, Arya, and the Lannister children, and ensure no sudden panic had erupted in the city upon news of the knights fighting. But first, he had to confirm there were no hidden pockets of Lannister men still lurking in the area. He dispatched some of his northern riders to patrol the roads, while Stannis did the same with his Stormland men. Amid the chaos, Robb found a moment to speak privately with his father. They stood at the edge of the captured camp, where the River Gate of King's Landing rose in the near distance. The smell of charred wood hung in the air. Robb's voice was subdued. "Father, there were many men I couldn't save, some from our own ranks. I know we did what we had to, but it's harder than I imagined." Ned clasped Robb's shoulder gently. "War spares no illusions. You did well, better than I could have asked, and we did need to break Tywin's hold. But do not lose your compassion, Robb. A lord who forgets the cost in blood becomes a monster." Robb nodded, gaze far away. "I won't forget. I swear it." Then he took a breath. "What now? Stannis is crowned. Tywin is captured. But we still have Renly, and who knows what he'll do." Ned ran a hand over his face. "We'll see. For the moment, we must get Tywin safely behind the Red Keep's walls, though ironically, that's where his grandchildren are also kept. I want to ensure there is no risk of a rescue attempt on the road. Then we'll fortify the city and see how the realm reacts to the news of his capture. With Tywin removed from the field, the Lannisters in the west might falter. If they cannot rally behind Jaime, assuming Jaime even can muster enough men from Casterly Rock, then the west may be forced to negotiate. That leaves Renly as our greatest threat." Robb scratched gray wind behind the ears as the dire wolf padded close, muzzle stained with dust and dried blood from the battle. "We'll face it together." They parted ways to continue the tasks of the day, each grappling with the burden of leadership. That evening, Ned and Robb led the column returning to King's Landing. Guards surrounded Tywin's horse, binding him so firmly he could scarcely guide the reins. Exhaustion weighed on every rider. When the city gates came into view, Ned caught sight of the ramparts bristling with gold cloaks, bows at the ready. Word of the victory must have reached them. As the gates opened, a ripple of relief spread through Ned's ranks. They were back behind stout walls, at least for now. Within the city, onlookers crowded the streets to see the result of the fighting. Many of the small folk craned their necks, hoping for a glimpse of Tywin Lannister in chains. Some shouted curses at him, blaming the Lannisters for the harsh reign of Joffrey and the endless rumors of incest. Others cowered away, uncertain if new violence might erupt. The gold cloaks escorted the captive lion through the winding roads up to the Red Keep, whose red stone glowed in the last of the day's light. At the gates of the Red Keep, King Stannis waited, flanked by Davos and a group of Baratheon knights. Tywin was dragged from his horse, stumbling when his legs nearly gave out. He regained his composure, though, glancing up at Stannis with a look of cold defiance. Stannis let the moment draw out. Then he said, "Take him to the black cells. He will be guarded day and night. If he so much as whispers an escape plan, cut out his tongue. I'll deal with him later." The guards seized Tywin's arms, hauling him forward. Ned stepped up, clearing his throat. "Your Grace, might we keep him in more secure quarters? The black cells can be precarious. If he bribes a guard." Stannis frowned. Hasn't your experience taught you the black cells are the most guarded and least comfortable place in this keep? Ned felt a wave of unease. It has, but Tywin Lannister is cunning. I worry that if he's kept in the same cells as common criminals, an unscrupulous guard might be more easily turned. Stannis' mouth tightened. We'll ensure the Watchers rotate. Ser Roland Storm will oversee them. He's proven loyal beyond doubt. And your own men can stand watch as well, if that eases your mind. Ned inclined his head. It was better than nothing. Thank you, Your Grace. I only wish to ensure no one undermines this victory. Tywin was led away, his footsteps echoing on the stones, accompanied by the stares of soldiers who took private satisfaction in seeing the great lion humbled. Cersei was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had not been informed yet, or was barred from meeting him. Ned suspected her reaction would be explosive once she realized her father was in chains. At last, Ned dismounted, feeling as though he might collapse with weariness. Robb did the same. The young man looked ready to drop, leaning heavily on Grey Wind for a moment. Then, with a faint smile, father and son entered the keep. Servants bowed, offering to draw them baths, to bring them food and drink. Ned accepted, as did Robb, though neither father nor son possessed much appetite after the bloodshed. Once cleaned and changed into fresher garments, Ned took the long walk to the Tower of the Hand, where the Lannister children remained under Stark guard. He felt a stab of guilt at not having checked on them sooner, but the urgency of battle had left no time. Now, as he neared the guarded door, 2 of his men bowed and allowed him entry. The sight inside was subdued. Tommen and Myrcella sat at a table, quietly playing a board game with carved wooden pieces that Sansa had provided. Joffrey perched on the window seat with an air of restless anger, ignoring them. When they saw Ned, Myrcella rose, looking frightened. Tommen shrank back. Joffrey simply glowered, his eyes full of spite. Ned cleared his throat. I trust you are all safe and well? Joffrey gave a bitter bark of laughter. Safe, locked away like beasts in a cage. Well, if you consider living under the watch of traitors to be, well, then yes, we're splendid. Myrcella interjected softly. We've had enough food, and Sansa came by earlier. Tommen looked at Ned with eyes too large for his face. Is it true you went to fight my grandfather? His voice trembled on the word grandfather. Ned answered carefully. It's true there was a battle outside the city. Your grandfather was taken prisoner, but he's alive. Myrcella let out a small gasp. He's a prisoner? Joffrey's hands flexed like claws, as though he wanted to throttle Ned from across the room. This is monstrous, he snarled. You dare treat the Lannisters this way? My mother will have your head. Ned tamped down his anger, reminding himself that Joffrey was still a youth, shaped by his mother's ambitions and cruelty. Your mother is in the keep, he said, and you'll have time to see her soon enough. But for now, it's best you remain here, for your own protection. Joffrey curled his lip. Protection from what? You're the one threatening us. Tommen began to cry, quietly, burying his face in his hands. Myrcella stood and touched her brother's shoulder, tears gathering in her own eyes. The rawness of it cut into Ned. He forced himself to remember Bran, forced from a window, forced himself to remember the cost if he did not keep these children in check. I will leave you to your rest, he said at last, lacking any better words to calm them. No harm will come to you, so long as your family does not force it. With that, he turned and departed, the door sealing behind him with the soft clunk of locks. The corridor outside seemed colder than before. Ned inhaled, trying to steady the swirl of conflicting emotions. Pity, guilt, resolution. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through until the realm was safe. But every step felt heavier now that he had undone House Lannister so thoroughly, leaving children in the lurch. Perhaps, he thought, Tywin had once felt the same sense of necessity, sacrificing others' well-being for what he deemed House Lannister's future. The parallel was not lost on Ned, and it tasted bitter indeed. That night, Ned found a moment to speak with his daughters. Sansa was in her room, brushing out her hair and humming softly, a lullaby from the north. She startled when Ned entered, then rushed to him and embraced him tightly, her eyes brimming. "Father, you're safe. I heard you won the battle. They said Lord Tywin was captured." Ned patted her shoulders gently. We did. There was bloodshed, but fewer losses than there might have been." Sansa's face flashed with sympathy. "I'm sorry for all those who died. It's awful, all this war. Do you think it will end now?" Ned sighed. "I'd like to think so, but there's still your mother's brother, Renly Baratheon, coming from the south. Another fight may loom, and your friend Myrcella. She's quite upset, as is Tommen. They know Tywin is captured." Sansa's eyes flickered with regret. "I've tried to be kind to them. Myrcella's sweet, truly. Tommen too. But Joffrey, I can't bear to look at him. I remember—" Her voice trailed off, recalling the day she'd been forced to watch the butcher's boy killed, and all the cruelties Joffrey had inflicted. Ned kissed her hair. "You do what you must. Show compassion to the innocents, but guard your heart. We cannot trust Joffrey. Remember that." Sansa nodded, hugging him once more, then letting him go. "I'll be careful. I promise." He found Arya in a small courtyard near the armory, drilling with Syrio-Farl. Wooden swords smacked in the moonlit gloom. Arya lunged and sidestepped, sweat plastering stray strands of hair to her forehead. Syrio guided her footwork with an occasional tap of his own practiced blade, urging her to flow like water, to keep moving. When Ned approached, Arya halted, panting. "Father," she greeted breathlessly. "I heard you're back. Did you kill Tywin Lannister yourself?" Ned allowed a faint smile. "No, child. We took him captive. I'd prefer fewer heads on spikes, if possible." Arya frowned. "That old lion deserves to lose his head for what he's done, just like the Queen." Ned felt a pang, reminded of Arya's growing sense of vengeance. "We do not kill for sport, Arya," he said, gently but firmly. "Justice must be measured. We don't become monsters in the process, or else we prove no better than they." She mulled that over, nodding slowly. Then she brightened. "Syrio says I'm getting better. Maybe soon I can have a real sword." Ned sighed, recalling how his younger self might have refused outright. But times were different. "We'll see. For now, keep practicing, but be mindful. This city is dangerous." With that, he left Arya to her practice, returning to his own chambers with a weariness so deep he felt it in his bones. A part of him yearned for the quiet of Winterfell, for the old gods in the Godswood, for the howling of wolves under the northern sky. But there was no going back to that simpler time. Not yet, possibly never. Come morning, the city bustled with the shocking news. Tywin Lannister had been captured by King Stannis. Some small folk cheered, remembering the gold cloak brutality under Joffrey. Others worried that it only meant a worse war if the Lannisters in the west rose up. Merchants fretted that chaos on the roads would impede trade. In the Red Keep, however, the mood was less uncertain. Stannis's men strutted with new confidence, while many courtiers who had previously wavered now flocked to swear fealty to the new king. But there remained one figure who had not yet faced the consequences. Cersei. She had been confined to certain quarters of the keep for weeks, allowed visits to her children only when guarded. That morning, Ned met with King Stannis in the Great Hall, a modest retinue of knights arrayed behind the throne. Stannis sat on the Iron Throne for the first official audience since capturing Tywin, a black and gold cloak draping his shoulders. The battered hall seemed more crowded than usual, with lords and ladies pressing in to watch. Ned had expected Cersei to be brought in under guard, yet when she appeared, she glided in with her chin held high, an elegant gown of crimson trailing behind her. 2 Baratheon soldiers flanked her, but she held herself as though she were the Queen Regent still. The hush that fell was thick with anticipation. Stannis regarded her with an expression of cool disdain. "Cersei of House Lannister, you stand before the rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. Do you know why you are here?" She returned his glare. "No doubt to be humiliated. You have my father in chains, you have my children under lock and key, and you sit upon the throne my late husband left behind." Stannis's voice was measured, but tension underlay it. Your husband was King Robert, yes, and you betrayed him by your incestuous liaison with your brother. You bore him no true heirs, only bastards. I name you traitor and conspirator in the death of the rightful monarchy. Cersei lifted her chin higher. I will not dignify your accusations with a reply. I am Queen Regent, mother to Joffrey. Stannis cut her off, voice rising. Joffrey is no Baratheon, as all now know. He is disinherited. Your father has fallen, your children are wards of the crown, and you yourself have no claim. You stand accused of treason. Murmurs rippled through the gathered onlookers. Ned, standing beside the throne, watched Cersei's face. He saw the flicker of fear that she tried so hard to mask. But also, beneath that, a fierce determination. She was not one to cower. So you mean to kill me? She asked, her tone edging toward a sneer. Will that make you feel more like a king? Stannis's hand closed around the hilt of the sword resting against the throne. I do not kill for pleasure, yet the penalty for treason is death. Lord Stark has counseled me that your children might be used to force Tywin to surrender. He has also counseled that your father's crimes are many. But what of you, Cersei? How do you answer for the turmoil you inflicted? Cersei laughed, a brittle sound. I see. You want me to grovel. Perhaps you want me to confess that I plotted to keep the throne for my children. Very well, I did all of it. I would do it again, because your brother was a fool, and you are a bigger fool if you think the realm is better off under your rule. Anger flashed in Stannis's eyes. He turned to Ned. Lord Hand, you have been the one to handle these matters so far. What do you propose we do with Cersei Lannister? A hush fell. Ned felt the scrutiny of every man and woman in the hall pressing on him. He remembered how Cersei had orchestrated so much suffering. Bran's fall, though it was Jaime who pushed him, she had conspired to keep it hidden. The cruelty to Sansa, the countless manipulations and near executions. Yet Ned also saw that every harsh measure he took now might provoke deeper unrest. He stepped forward. Your Grace, he began, choosing his words slowly. Cersei Lannister played a key role in the false claim that nearly tore the realm apart. She has flouted the laws of gods and men. By rights, she should face trial for treason. But I counsel that we hold her for now, as we do Tywin, and set a date for a proper trial. Let the realm see that we do not condemn a noble lady to death without due process. A murmur of assent spread among some of the onlookers. Stannis studied Ned, then turned back to Cersei. A trial. You shall be confined until that day. If you have any evidence in your favor, you may present it. Cersei's lips parted, perhaps to deliver some scathing retort, but she swallowed it, eyes darting between Ned and Stannis. A trial, she repeated softly. How very just, and who will sit in judgment? The wolves and the stags? Or will you grant me a jury of my peers from the west? Stannis gave a curt gesture. We'll name a council of lords representing multiple regions. House Tyrell, House Tully, even the north. Perhaps Dorne. If you are found guilty, the sentence could be anything from imprisonment to exile or death. But the outcome will be decided in the light of day. Cersei eyed Ned, some mixture of hatred and reluctant respect. Then she raised her chin again. I will await your farce of a trial, and you will see how quickly the realm can turn against you, Stannis Baratheon, if you handle these matters poorly. Stannis snapped, Guards, take her away. They moved forward, seizing her arms. She did not resist, but she cast a final venomous glance at Ned. Then she was gone, carried off to a more secure lodging, no doubt under heavy lock and key. A pall of tension lingered in the hall. Stannis exhaled, as though unclenching from the confrontation, and rose from the throne. That was enough ceremony for one morning, he muttered to no one in particular. Davos, see that the watch is doubled at the dungeon. Lord Stark, we must speak of Renly. Ned bowed. The hall began to empty, courtiers dispersing in a swirl of hushed conversation. Even in victory, a sense of foreboding hung over everything. With Tywin in chains, the realm had lost one threat. Yet Renly and the Tyrells remained unaccounted for, and there were countless ways war could flare anew. In the small council chamber, lit by narrow windows, Ned, Davos, Robb, and a few others gathered around Stannis. The king sat at the head of the table, drum-tight tension in his posture. A map of southern Westeros lay spread before them, markers indicating known positions of Renly's host. The last word from scouts placed Renly about a week's march south, near the border between the Crownlands and the Reach. "He will come for the city," Stannis said flatly. "He can posture all he likes about saving the realm from Lannisters, but with Tywin captured, that leaves me as his prime obstacle. He might prefer to starve us out or seek a decisive field battle. Either way, we must prepare." Ned studied the map. "If he's wise, he'll attempt to cut off our supplies, blockade the Rose Road, and wait. King's Landing can't feed itself for long, especially with an influx of northern soldiers who also require provisions." Lord Manderly coughed, stepping forward. "We have some shipments from White Harbor, my lord, but that's reliant on sea routes. If Renly has allies at sea, or if the Red Wine fleet sails for him, that supply line could be threatened too." Davos rubbed his chin. "The Red Wines are tied to the Tyrells. So is Tarly, so is Mullendor. The power of the Reach is vast. I fear we'll be outnumbered if they mean open war." Stannis's gaze swept the table. "Then do we stand behind the city walls, hoping to outlast them? Or do we strike in the field again, as we did with Tywin?" Robb spoke up. "A siege can be devastating. The small folk will suffer first. If we have the numbers, an open field might be safer. But if Renly has triple our soldiers, that's no easy fight." He tapped a finger on the map. "We could attempt to lure him into a disadvantageous position, like we did with Tywin." Ned nodded, proud of his son's measured thinking. "Yes, but it will be harder this time. Renly has good generals, Mace Tyrell, Randall Tarly, perhaps others. They won't be as vulnerable to a sudden strike. And we can't rely on hostages to keep them at bay, as we did with Tywin's grandchildren. Renly doesn't share blood with them." Stannis grimaced. "I'm no fool. We have one advantage. Tywin's capture might send a message that the crown can defend itself. Some lords might think twice about supporting Renly if it looks like we're unstoppable." Davos ventured carefully. "Or they might see it as proof they must ally with him soon, before they too are forced into submission." Silence fell. Stannis drummed his fingers on the table. "We must try to parley with Renly one more time, though I doubt he'll see reason. Lord Stark, you have skill in persuasion, despite your unflinching honesty, or perhaps because of it. Will you lead an envoy to speak with my brother? If he can be turned from his path, the realm could be spared another war. If not, we'll know soon enough." Ned hesitated, remembering how Renly had pressed him for an alliance, offering to share power and supplant Stannis. But he also recalled that Renly was not as cold or law-obsessed as Stannis. He was a man who liked admiration and easy solutions. Perhaps with Tywin out of the picture, Renly might settle for a favorable arrangement. "I will go," Ned said, "but we must choose who accompanies me carefully." Robb said at once, "Father, let me come with you." Ned shook his head. "No, we need you here to help fortify the city in case we fail. You're the Stark in the field, the commander who might be called upon if Renly attacks. Trust me, I'll manage." Robb looked as though he might protest, but he pressed his lips together and nodded. "As you say." Stannis motioned to Davos. "You'll go as well, Ser Davos. My brother knows you speak for me." Davos bowed. "It will be my honor, your grace." Ned turned to the others. "We'll keep the envoy small. A handful of knights, a standard bearer. We'll ride out tomorrow at dawn, meet Renly's host on the road, assuming they allow us approach." Stannis gave a curt nod, then pushed away from the table. "That's settled. Lord Stark, try your best. If Renly remains obstinate, we'll have no choice but to muster every sword in this city and fight him. For the good of the realm, let us hope he sees reason." Ned privately thought that reason was often overshadowed by ambition in King's Landing, but he held his tongue. Soon after, they dispersed, each to finalize preparations for the uncertain mission. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ned tasked Robb and the northern lords with fortifying the city's gates and provisioning the gold cloaks. Stannis' men aided them, though tension sometimes sparked between Northmen and Stormlanders. Neither group used to working side by side. Meanwhile, King Stannis made a show of touring the city markets, proclaiming that he intended to stabilize prices and punish profiteers. Some small folk found hope in that. Others remained suspicious of any new king's promises. That evening, Ned dined with Robb, Sansa, Arya, and Catelyn, who had arrived only that morning, having ridden hard from Riverrun after hearing rumors of Tywin's capture. The meal was modest, fish and fresh bread, though the keep's kitchens had improved with the new supply lines. Catelyn's eyes held relief at seeing Ned still alive, yet also a deep concern that overshadowed any joy. "It's good to have you here, Cat," Ned said quietly after the meal. The children had gone off to their respective corners, and the two of them sat by a corner hearth. "I was worried you might ride into danger if you came south." She took his hand. "I had to be certain you were well. Riverrun is still threatened by stray Lannister forces, but with Tywin captured, they've less coordination. My uncle Brynden remains there, fortifying the lands. Edmure wanted to come too, but I bade him stay. One Tully here is enough." Ned squeezed her hand. "I'm glad to have you. War is not yet done, but we're closer to something resembling peace than we were." Catelyn studied him, brows knit. "Peace? Not if Renly means to challenge Stannis. The Tyrells are formidable, Ned. Our northern host is strong, but many will question whether they can stand against the combined might of the Reach. And then there's the Vale, silent behind Lysa's refusal to join. Dorne is in question, though Oberin remains in the city. The realm is fractured in too many places." Ned's shoulders sagged. "I know. Tomorrow I ride to treat with Renly. Pray the gods let him see that we have no wish to spill more blood. If Tywin's downfall shows him we won't be easily broken, perhaps he'll relent." She gave a soft sigh. "I pray for that every night. Just be careful. Renly is charming, but he's not your friend. He wants power." Ned nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I remember that well." They parted for the night, and Ned tried to find rest. Sleep proved elusive, haunted by dreams of the battlefield and of Tywin's glare. He saw again the looks on Myrcella's and Tommen's faces. In the darkest hours, Ned questioned whether he had truly done right, or if he had become a man he no longer recognized. But whenever he came close to self-condemnation, he remembered the dead butcher's boy, the half-crippled Bran, the threats to Sansa and Arya. This is war, he told himself. War spares no illusions. He drifted into a fitful sleep just before dawn broke. Morning arrived in a wash of pale sunlight over the rooftops. Ned assembled his small envoy, Davos Seaworth in his plain garb, 2 Baratheon knights wearing Stannis' stag sigil, and a trio of Ned's own loyal Northmen. They rode out through the King's Gate, the city behind them a swirl of uncertain watchers. Sentries called after them with good wishes, though more out of habit than conviction. The roads south were dusty, carrying the scars of frequent troop movements. Here and there, Ned spotted burned-out farms, evidence that the realm's unrest had not been contained to distant riverlands. They rode hard, hoping to meet Renly's host in open terrain. Now and then, they passed small folk fleeing toward the city, wagons piled with meager possessions, eyes wide with fear at the rumored approach of yet another army. On the second day, they spotted scouts bearing the green and gold banners of House Tyrell. Word traveled swiftly that an envoy from the usurper's brother was approaching. Ned was quick to clarify they came from King Stannis, not Renly, but the scouts only nodded, expressionless, and bade them wait while they carried word to their lords. By dusk, the envoy found themselves guided to a broad meadow near a shallow river, where a vast encampment spread out. Tents of bright gold and green abounded, the Tyrell sigil adorning many of them, though Renly's personal banner, the stag on rich green, could also be seen. Ned was struck by how large the camp was, far larger than Tywin's had been. If those men marched on King's Landing, they might form a ring around the city that even Stannis and the North combined would struggle to break. He maintained a steady face as they were ushered into the heart of the camp. At last, they came upon a grand pavilion, striped in green and gold, a standard of a stag crowned with roses fluttering in the breeze. Outside stood armored knights of the Reach, their plate polished, their surcoats bright. Ser Loras Tyrell himself emerged, still youthful and handsome, though his features were set with tension as he eyed Ned Stark. "Lord Hand," Loras said, voice cool, "you come as an envoy from King Stannis, I hear. If that is so, I suppose we should treat you courteously." Ned inclined his head. "Ser Loras, we come in peace to treat with Lord Renly, or King Renly as he styles himself. May we be admitted?" Loras glanced at Davos and the rest of the party. "Your arms, if you please. We can't allow armed men near Lord Renly, not after the stories we've heard of King's Landing." Ned recognized the uneasy logic. He dismounted and signaled for his men to do the same, handing over their swords. Davos followed suit without protest. 2 Tyrell men-at-arms collected the weapons and offered to stable the horses. Then Loras led them inside the pavilion. The interior was spacious, lit by lanterns that cast a soft glow over finely woven carpets. A long table occupied the center, laden with maps, fresh fruit, wine, and bread. Renly Baratheon stood at the far end, dressed in splendid attire. A green doublet embroidered with golden stags, a cloak trimmed in fur, though the weather was mild. Beside him hovered Mace Tyrell, heavy-set and richly dressed, and Randyll Tarly, who wore an austere expression. Several other Reach lords were present. Mathis Rowan, Leighton Hightower's representative, and others. They fell silent at Ned's approach. Renly turned, a brilliant smile spreading across his face, though it did not reach his eyes. "Lord Eddard Stark, how splendid to see you again. Davos Seaworth as well. I trust you haven't come all this way to bend the knee to me, but I welcome you nonetheless." Ned forced a polite nod. "I come in peace, Lord Renly, on behalf of King Stannis, to propose terms that might spare the realm further bloodshed." Renly's lips twisted wryly. "Ah, yes, you're King Stannis. How is my dour brother faring with that iron throne jammed under him? Did he enjoy capturing Tywin? I hear it was quite a show." Mace Tyrell grunted. "A show indeed. They say Tywin Lannister is in the Black Cells. Is that true, Lord Stark?" Ned replied, "He's secured within the Red Keep, yes. That threat is contained. We have no wish to spill more blood. King Stannis believes a peaceful resolution with you is still possible." Renly laughed short and bright. "Peaceful resolution? Such as what? He abdicates and proclaims me king." Ned's gaze swept the gathered lords. "If you relinquish your claim and acknowledge Stannis as the lawful king, you'd be named heir presumptive, unless Stannis fathers children. You could hold paramount offices, perhaps master of laws or the like. The Tyrells would keep their lands and titles. The realm could unify once again, rather than fracturing under multiple claimants." A hush fell in the pavilion. Randyll Tarly frowned, arms folded. Mace Tyrell drummed his fingers on the table. Renly let out a breath, scanning the circle of watchers. "And what if I say no?" he said softly. "Do you plan to threaten me with the same fate as Tywin Lannister? Do you hold some of my loved ones hostage?" Ned's face hardened. "We hold no hostages from your line. We only ask that you see reason. The realm needs unity, not a second rebellion." Renly paced to the table, poured himself a cup of wine. "Unity, yes, always unity. And yet my brother is hardly a unifying figure. He's as stiff as an iron rod. The lords of the Reach would find him unpleasant. I, on the other hand, have won them through charm and alliances. Why should I yield if half the realm would prefer me?" Mace Tyrell spoke up, voice ponderous. "It's true enough that the small folk loved your brother Robert, not for his legal claim but for his vigor. Stannis lacks that. He lacks warmth." Randyll Tarly nodded, adding, "A king must inspire loyalty as well as fear. Stannis is good at fear, less so at loyalty." Ned felt frustration rising. "Law is the bedrock of the realm. If men set law aside whenever they find another candidate more charming, we'll face endless civil wars. Robert's rebellion had cause. The Mad King. Here, The cause is not tyranny but ambition. Renly sipped his wine. And yet, dear Lord Stark, can you say truly that Stannis would be a beloved king? Or that he would not bring about fresh tyranny with his unyielding ways? What of the rumor that the Lannister children remain hostage, that Cersei is locked in the keep? Some might call that tyranny already. Ned drew a steadying breath. Cersei Lannister is being held for trial on charges of treason, as is Tywin. The children are wards, not hostages. We are protecting them from the consequences of their family's acts. That is not tyranny. That is justice. Ser Loras, standing near the entrance, spoke quietly. Yet you must know how it looks, and men's perceptions often matter more than truth in times of upheaval. Renly's gaze shifted to Ned with a hint of sympathy. I do not doubt your sincerity, Ned Stark, but the question remains. Why should we kneel to a man we neither love nor respect? Ned felt the weight of the realm pressing on him. He recalled how Robert had laughed with men, had drawn them to his side with feasts and battles. Stannis lacked that gift, and Renly was the spitting image of a younger Robert, minus some of his older brother's raw strength but possessing a cunning that Robert never truly had. So you mean to press your claim, Ned said. You'll march on the city, risk thousands of lives, all because you believe the realm would prefer a more amiable king? Renly set down his cup, posture sharpening. The realm deserves a king who can keep the lords united, handle matters gracefully, and ensure prosperity. Ask yourself, is Stannis that king? Will he not alienate every lord who disagrees with him? You know his nature. Davos stepped forward. He is stern, yes, but he's lawful and will protect the realm. Renly, we do not want to see Baratheon steel clash with Baratheon steel. Renly's face flickered with a moment of genuine regret. Nor do I, Ser Davos, but it might be inevitable. If Stannis refuses to yield, and I refuse to yield, the best talk we can have here is about how many men will die. Ned found himself grasping at any avenue to avert war. What if we attempt a compromise that does not place all power in one man's hand? Some form of co-regency or council that grants you leadership in the south, while Stannis rules from the capital. It's unorthodox, but these are dire times. Mace Tyrell and Randyll Tarly exchanged skeptical looks. Renly let out a soft chuckle. 2 kings, each with half a kingdom? That's the surest path to confusion. And eventually one would overshadow the other. No, Ned, that's not a solution. A frustrated hush followed. Ned could sense the polite veneer was wearing thin. Finally, Renly spoke again, more quietly. I do not desire needless carnage. But if Stannis insists on calling me a traitor, I have no choice but to defend my claim. We are already too far gone for half measures. If your only offer is that I kneel, then you have your answer. I will not kneel. Ned's heart sank. Then you mean to march on King's Landing? Renly nodded, lips set in a grim line. Unless your king yields, would you advise him to yield? Silence. Ned wished there was a path to reconciliation. But Stannis yielding would shred all sense of legitimacy to the throne. He met Renly's eyes. You know I can't. Stannis is the rightful heir. Your claim stands in opposition to the law. Renly's jaw tightened. Then we are at an impasse. You may return to your king and tell him that if he opens the gates and stands aside, we can avoid bloodshed. Otherwise, I'll do what I must. Ned bowed his head, acceptance heavy in his chest. So be it. But know this, Renly Baratheon, if you come in war, King's Landing is well fortified. My men, and the men of the north, will fight at Stannis' side. The city will not fall easily, and the realm will bleed. Renly's expression flickered with pain. Then we are all undone, he whispered. I had hoped for better, truly, but sometimes, Ned, the better man is not the lawful man. Fare you well. With that, the meeting concluded. Ned and his small party withdrew, collected their arms, and rode away under the watchful eye of Tyrell scouts. As they left the encampment, night crept across the sky. The next morning, they set a swift pace back toward King's Landing, each man brooding over the inevitable clash that now loomed. The only mercy was that no violence had erupted right there in Renly's camp. But soon enough, the swords would be drawn. When Ned's group returned to the city gates, they found a tense atmosphere. The news had raced ahead that Renly refused to bend. Stannis was already mustering troops, commanding that archers and scorpions be placed on the walls, that the city's stockpiles be inventoried. Felt like the calm before a deadly storm. Ned reported the result of his parley in the Red Keep's council chamber. Stannis listened in stony silence, knuckles whitening on the table's edge. When Ned finished, the king said, "So, he means to take the city or force me out. Very well. I faced siege and storm before. We'll see which brothers will break first." Ned tried one last time. "Your Grace, a siege here would starve the small folk. Perhaps we can move out. Face Renly in the field away from the city." Stannis glowered. "Abandon the city to chaos while we run out to meet him? That's what Renly wants. Then he can slip a smaller force behind and open the gates when we're gone. No, we keep our forces here, defend the walls, and if he tries an assault, we'll break him." Ned recognized the logic, though it carried grave risks. "As you command, Your Grace." He turned to Robb, who stood near the door. "Begin reinforcing the gates and walls with our own men. The gold cloaks can't be everywhere. Also, see that we do what we can for the small folk, bread, water, basic needs. We can't let them starve before the siege even begins." Robb nodded, face set with determination. "I'll see to it at once." Stannis rose, a swirl of tension emanating from him. "I'll prepare the royal fleet as well, assuming it's still worthy of that name. We'll guard Blackwater Bay to prevent any Tyrell ships from sailing up the river." Dismissed. The lords and knights dispersed. Ned trailed behind, mind-churning. Renly's forces were formidable, perhaps outnumbering them. Even with Tywin out of the equation, a single battle might decide the realm's fate if the city fell. And what of Tywin's captive status? Could he be used as a bargaining chip with Renly? Likely not, for Renly had no special stake in Tywin's well-being. The old lion might languish in a cell while the realm erupted once more. That night, Ned visited the black cells with a pair of trusted guards, determined to see Tywin personally. He carried a lantern down the narrow stairwell, the walls damp and rank. The rattle of chains and the moans of distant prisoners echoed. At the bottom, Ser Roland Storm greeted him, face grim. "Lord Stark, you come late." Ned nodded. "I need a private word with Tywin." Briefly, Ser Roland hesitated, then stood aside. "He's in the last cell." Ned proceeded down the dripping corridor. Rats scurried, water dripped. At the final cell, 2 guards flanked the iron bars. By the glow of his lantern, Ned saw Tywin Lannister seated on a cot, arms still bound in some measure, though a chain attached to the wall allowed him minimal movement. His tunic was dirty. The wound on his temple had scabbed over, yet his eyes glinted in the darkness as Ned approached. "Ah, Lord Stark," Tywin said quietly. "How kind of you to visit." Ned cleared his throat, ignoring the sarcasm. "Are they feeding you? Tending your wound?" Tywin flexed a shoulder. "A healer came by. They feed me. Conditions aren't luxurious, but I've survived worse." "Why waste your pity, Stark?" Ned didn't reply immediately. He studied the old lion for a moment. Here was the man who'd nearly crushed the Riverlands, who had once outmaneuvered so many foes, now caged like a beast. "I came to see if you have anything to say, now that Renly marches. Would you prefer to negotiate your release in exchange for an alliance?" Tywin's lips curved in a cold smile. "You think I'd ally with Stannis after he put me in a cell? My only priority now is to see that my family survives, that my grandchildren remain safe. If you'd let them go, maybe we'd talk. But you won't, will you?" Ned set his jaw. "I cannot release them, not while the realm is in this state. You must see that. We need them as leverage, and as protection from your cunning." Tywin gave a soft bark of disdainful laughter. "My cunning is moot now that I'm locked in here, but go on, treat them as bargaining chips. And watch how the realm sours on your justice." Ned resisted the urge to lash back. Renly is coming with the might of the Reach. He has no reason to free you, nor to help your grandchildren. If King's Landing falls, you might be left to rot here or be put to the sword. Is that what you want?" Tywin's gaze flickered with a hint of something. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. "I've never wanted this, Stark. I've always wanted House Lannister secure, powerful. My children safe. It's you and your self-righteous king who hold them in thrall. So if you want me to beg for release, you'll die waiting." Ned studied him for a moment, a swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest. "I'll see that your grandchildren remain unharmed if there's any chance of war overtaking the city. But I cannot free them or you. Not until the realm is stable. If you ever change your mind about helping us avoid further bloodshed, send word." Tywin's mouth twisted. "What you're really asking is whether I'll help you stop Renly. But what do I gain from that? If Stannis holds the throne, he'll want my head. You think a man who's had me locked in a cell would show mercy once the dust settles?" Ned found no easy answer. "That depends on the realm's need for stability. If your loyalty ensures the West's compliance, perhaps that loyalty could earn some pardon. You can measure Stannis's nature as well as I can. He's stern, but not a madman." Tywin stared at him, then gave a derisive snort. "I'll think on it, for all the good it will do me. Now leave me, Stark, unless you mean to watch me rot in the dark." Ned bowed his head slightly and turned away. "Good night, Lord Tywin." He made his way back up the steps, the weight of 1,000 worries dragging his feet. Tywin might be proud, but the old lion was cornered. Could that cornered lion become an ally against Renly? It seemed improbable. Yet the realm was full of improbable alliances in dire times. Ned resolved to speak to Stannis about it, though he could guess how the king would respond. The next fortnight passed in a tense flurry of preparations. Scouts rode out daily, returning with reports of Renly's progress. His army advanced steadily, no sign of hesitation. The roads leading south from King's Landing were clogged with refugees, adding pressure to the city's resources. Inside the walls, Stannis instituted rationing, ordering that loaves of bread be priced fairly, punishing any merchant who hoarded grain. It was an attempt to keep the population calm, but rumors of an impending siege spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, Ned and Robb worked tirelessly with the gold cloaks to reinforce the gates, dig ditches, and position archers along the walls. Catelyn helped coordinate relief for the incoming smallfolk, setting up makeshift camps near the city squares, distributing what provisions they could spare. Even Sansa and Arya contributed, each in their own way. Sansa by assisting in the distribution of bread, Arya by joining small errands as a runner, sometimes slipping through alleyways with messages. This was not a time for idle hands. Atop the battlements, the tension crackled. Night after night, torches glimmered along the city's perimeter, watchful for any sign of approach. Renly had yet to appear over the horizon, but that only sharpened the anxiety, the not knowing. Some nights, Ned walked the ramparts alone, remembering Robert, imagining him roaring with laughter in some distant realm. The memory hurt. If only Robert had fathered a true heir, none of this would be happening. Instead, they circled a pit of conflict that threatened to swallow them whole. Finally, scouts confirmed that Renly's army would arrive within a day. Ned joined King Stannis, Davos, Robb, and other commanders on the southern walls, gazing out at the rolling fields beyond the city. In the distance, dust rose from many feet and hooves. Banners fluttered in the faint morning light. "This is it," Stannis said. "He'll likely encamp beyond bow range and see if we cower. We'll not open the gates. If he tries a direct assault, we'll burn his siege towers. If he tries to blockade us, we'll see how long he can feed his own men with the harvest failing." Ned frowned. "The city won't last long in a blockade either, Your Grace. Our stores are finite, unless we attempt to ferry supplies in from the sea. But the Tyrells might soon bring their navy if they secure the Red Wine fleet." Stannis shrugged, jaw set. "Then it will come to a test of wills or a pitched battle. We'll not yield." Robb held a spyglass scanning the fields. "They have cavalry in abundance, by the look of it, and foot soldiers, More than we do, I'd wager. He glanced at his father. If they scale the walls with enough siege equipment, the numbers alone could be telling. Ned nodded, tension knotting in his belly. We must be vigilant. Let's station our best men at each gate. We have scorpions on the walls, boiling oil prepared. If they come, we'll meet them with everything we have. The hours dragged. Sure enough, Renly's host arrived in a great sweep of green and gold banners, forming a ring of tents beyond arrow range. Scouts and outriders tested the roads. Siege engines, or the makings of them, could be seen rolling in from the rear. The city braced, and as the sun sank, the watchers on the wall saw the glow of thousands of campfires. Morning came again. The standstill began. Over the next few days, runners approached the city under flags of truce, bearing messages from Renly, offering the same ultimatum. Open the gates, disavow Stannis, and the city would be spared. Stannis refused. Archers on the walls threatened any closer approach. The small folk huddled in their homes, terrified of what a siege might bring. But no immediate assault followed. Instead, Renly's camp grew more organized, lines of trenches dug, watchtowers erected, roads patrolled. Gradually, the noose tightened. The southern roads were sealed, the farmland around the city claimed by Renly's foragers. A sense of dread seeped into King's Landing like a chill wind through a cracked window. One day, from the battlements, Ned watched with disquiet as a small party from Renly's camp ventured out and parleyed with some men approaching from the west. He thought he glimpsed a lion banner. Could that be a Lannister relief force from the west, or perhaps a group of sellswords seeking employment? If so, would they ally with Renly to free Tywin? The puzzle turned Ned's stomach. Another day, a group of peasants from outside the city tried to slip in, half-starved, claiming they had no choice but to come for bread. Renly's outriders chased them, and the city archers drew on the outriders. Ned was forced to decide if they'd shoot at men who threatened refugees. In the end, a volley of warning shots from the walls scared off Renly's horsemen, and the peasants were dragged inside. Tensions spiked. The next morning, a messenger from Renly delivered a stern complaint that the city had fired on his men. An act of war. Stannis scoffed, calling it hypocrisy. A sullen standoff. Every day, Ned prayed for a miracle. A letter from the Vale, a shift in the wind from Dorne, anything that might tip the balance and avoid a bloodbath. But no miracle came. Instead, the city worried about the approach of winter, about the lines of supply. The gold cloaks were pressed to keep order. Fistfights broke out in bread lines. Rumors flared that Stannis intended to burn the city rather than yield it. Renly's camp turned to raiding outlying villages for food. The realm cracked under the strain. One afternoon, as Ned paced the ramparts, he spied an unusual commotion in Renly's lines. Horns braying, men rushing about. He tensed, expecting an assault. But then he realized the horns were blowing west, not toward the city. Something else was happening outside the ring of watchers. He squinted. Ed, heart pounding, half expecting an army from Casterly Rock. Moments later, a clarion call arose from the city gates. Another host approached from the west. Ned rushed down, meeting Robb by the barbican. Scouts galloped in, breathless, reporting that a large force bearing the sigil of House Frye was crossing the Riverlands, possibly some Tully or Stark allies. Or it could be a trick. Ned's mind raced. Could Edmure Tully have decided to march south after all, to break the siege from behind? Or was it a false banner, a band of sellswords? The gates remained shut, but watchers peered from the battlements, trying to discern the truth. As dusk fell, more detailed scouts arrived. It was not just Frye banners, they said, but Tully ones as well, and the Blackfish himself rode at their head. Possibly as many as 10,000 men from the Riverlands had mustered, presumably to lift the siege or at least threaten Renly's flank. Ned's spirit soared at the possibility that Edmure and Brynden Tully had come. But how would that clash with Renly's forces, which greatly outnumbered them? A new layer of complexity was added to an already fraught standoff. Morning light revealed the lines more clearly. To the west, perched along the Rose Road, a host under the Tully banner and that of House Frye had established a modest encampment. From the city walls, Ned could see them arrayed in a defensive posture. Renly's men reacted at once, shifting a portion of their siege lines to face this new threat. The city now had a potential ally beyond the Ring of Steel, though still outnumbered. A precarious balance formed. That day, negotiations began anew, with the Tully host sending messengers to Renly's lines. Another day passed without open battle, as the various armies tried to figure out who might ally with whom. Ned prayed that the Tully presence would force Renly to break off the siege. Meanwhile, word reached him that the Riverlands had nearly collapsed under repeated Lannister raids, so Edmure's forces might be battered. Was it enough to tip the balance? Amid all this, Ned found moments to check on the Lannister children once more. Joffrey simmered in hatred. Myrcella was quiet and pale. Tommen clung to stuffed animals for comfort. They had heard the city might be under siege. Myrcella asked if they would die if the city fell. Ned promised to keep them safe, a promise he prayed he could keep. Cersei, still confined, had grown increasingly sullen. She no longer raged openly, but when Ned saw her by chance in a corridor, always surrounded by guards, she spat at him, calling him a monster. He tried not to dwell on it. Tywin remained in his cell. The old lion made no further attempts at negotiation, and Stannis refused to even consider a meeting. On the 5th day of the standoff, Ned was summoned to the walls by frantic shouts. Rushing up the stone steps, he saw from the battlements that Renly's forces were moving, splitting, in fact. One portion marched west toward the Tully encampment, while a sizable portion remained to keep watch on the city. The sky churned with gathering storm clouds, darkening the midday light. Robb joined him, scanning the fields with worry. "They're going to engage the Tully forces," Robb said, face pale. "It'll draw them out, or crush them where they stand." Ned nodded gravely. "Renly must see them as a threat to his siege. If he destroys them, we lose any chance of relief. If they defeat him, the city might be free." Stannis arrived behind them wearing a breastplate. He frowned. "If they battle out there, we could sortie from the city gates, strike Renly's lines from behind while he's distracted." Robb blinked. "That might work, Your Grace, if you're prepared for the risk. We'd be leaving the city somewhat vulnerable if they have reserves." Ned weighed the prospect. A two-front attack could devastate Renly, or it could turn catastrophic if the Tyrells had enough men to pin both forces. "Your Grace, we'd need perfect timing. The Tullys and Freys must coordinate with us, or else we might blunder into each other's swords." Stannis set his jaw. "Send a messenger. Let them know we plan to strike if they draw Renly out. If they can hold him for half an hour, we'll come from behind." He turned to Ned. "Will you lead the sortie?" Ned hesitated, glancing at Robb. "I should. Robb can coordinate city defenses if something goes wrong." Robb started to object, but Ned laid a hand on his arm. "We must work as one. I'll ride with Stannis to lead the men out. You hold the gates, ensure no infiltration. If we fail, you must protect your sisters and the others." Reluctantly, Robb nodded, understanding the burden. "Then may the gods watch over you, Father." A raven was swiftly dispatched to the Tully camp, proposing the coordinated strike. Hours ticked by in tense anticipation. The watchers on the wall could see Renly's men forming lines, presumably to march on the Tully position. Storm clouds rolled overhead, lightning flickering in the distance. Ned pictured the Tully camp, Edmure or Brynden reading the Raven, deciding whether to trust Stannis in a joint maneuver. Any number of things could go wrong. As dusk approached, a single raven returned, bearing a simple note scrawled in Edmure's hand. "We will engage. Wait for my signal." A volley of flaming arrows. Ned showed it to Stannis, who nodded. That was that. There would be a battle on the morrow, likely in the western fields. If fortune favored them, the siege might be lifted. If not, the city would stand alone again, weaker than before. All night, the city crackled with tension. Rain began to fall in a steady patter, turning roads to mud. Soldiers huddled in cloaks, struggling to keep weapons dry. Ned paced the courtyard, rehearsing tactics in his mind. Stannis, never one for indecision, had assigned men to the gates, men to hold certain ramparts, men to follow him out. Davos would remain behind as master of ships to keep watch on the bay. The plan hinged on the Tully host holding out long enough for the city's forces to sally forth and catch Renly's lines from behind. Dawn arrived, gray and cold, the rain easing to a drizzle. Ned gathered with Stannis near the southern gates, the hollow echo of boots on wet stone accompanying them. Soldiers assembled in columns, carrying house banners. The stag of Baratheon, the dire wolf of Stark, the merman of Manderley, the sunburst of Karstark. Not as grand as Renly's numbers, but a determined force. Ned wore his armor, helm tucked under his arm, heart pounding. He forced a calm facade. Soon, horns blared from the walls, a signal that Renly's main body was on the move, marching west. If they intended to crush the Tullys quickly, that was the moment to strike. Stannis scowled at the gloom. "We'll wait for the flaming arrows. That's the sign Edmure promised." They waited. The minutes stretched, each droplet of rain pitter-pattering on the courtyard. Tension coiled. Then, at last, from the battlements came a shout. "Look! The signal!" Peering through the rain, Ned made out faint streaks of orange rising in the distance. A volley of arrows lit by fire. Could only be from the Tully lines. Now or never. "Open the gates!" Stannis roared. The portcullis rattled upward. A vanguard of knights surged out, splashing into the muddy road, banners streaming. Ned was in the second wave, sword in hand, surrounded by men from the north. Stannis rode at the head of the first wave, cloak soaked by drizzle. The city behind them, they advanced into the open field. The plan was to swing around Renly's rearguard quickly, striking from behind while they engaged the Tully Fry force. Lightning flashed overhead, thunder growling in the distance. Rain dampened the ground, turning it slick. Horses snorted, struggling for footing. Men's breaths plumed in the chill. Still, they pressed on, hearts pounding. Within half an hour, they saw the clash on the horizon. Renly's green and gold lines arrayed against the Tully's riverfish banners, with the Fry towers interspersed. Gleams of steel flashed in the dawn light. The rumble of marching men, the clash of arms, drifted over the fields. Tension soared. Stannis spurred his warhorse. "Forward!" he barked. Ned and the others followed suit, quickening into a trot, then a canter. The ground blurred beneath them. Rain whipped their faces. The thunder of hooves matched the thunder in the sky. They hit Renly's rearguard in a sudden shock of steel and shouting. Confusion erupted among the Tyrell bannermen who hadn't expected an attack from behind. A swirl of cavalry, pikes, mud, and terrified horses. Ned slashed at a foot soldier, unseating him. Arrows hissed overhead. A Tyrell knight lunged at Ned, sword glancing off Ned's breastplate. Ned countered, striking the knight down. Stannis' voice cut through the din, urging his men to press deeper, to flank Renly's main line. Ned glimpsed Tully men, battered but holding firm, surging forward with new heart as they saw relief from the city. The field churned with chaos. Shouts and screams blended into the pounding rain. Yet for all their surprise advantage, Renly's host was vast, and they recovered quickly. Knights in shining plate rallied. Archers pivoted to fire on the new threat. Men of the Reach brandished spears and halberds, forming bristling lines. The mud made cavalry maneuvers treacherous, horses stumbling. Riders pitched into the muck. Ned had to fight tooth and nail to keep his formation intact, calling to the Northmen, "Stay together! Forward! Forward!" A swirl of confusion parted, and Ned found himself near a standard-bearer of House Tyrell. The man was cut down by a Tully soldier before Ned's eyes, the banner collapsing in the mud. Another wave of Tyrell knights rushed in, crashing against the Tully line. Ned spurred his horse, seeking a vantage to see how Stannis fared. Lightning cracked overhead. In a brief flare, Ned saw Stannis locked in combat with a tall knight bearing the gold rose on his shield. Their swords clanged. Blood streaked the knight's arm. Stannis hammered relentlessly. Ned urged his horse closer, forging a path through the press, defending himself against a furious hail of blows from lesser knights. He glimpsed Edmure Tully's banner across the swirling mass, indicating the Tully Lord was here in person, or so it seemed. The storm worsened, rain pelting them sideways. Visibility shrank. Shouts turned raw. Ned's eyes stung from sweat and rain. All he could do was press on, leading men in small bursts of tactical pushes. Now and then, he heard cries of, "For King Stannis," or "For the King in the North." Though Robb was not present, some men still used the old rallying call. And from the other side, "For Renly, High Garden, Tyrell." In the thick of it, Ned's horse slipped, nearly throwing him. He gasped, fighting for balance, splattering mud up his legs. A Tyrell spearman lunged at him. Ned parried desperately, the clash jarring his arms. The man tried again, but one of Ned's Northmen tackled him from the side, burying an axe in his shoulder. Ned nodded in thanks and regained his seat. They pressed on. Slowly, the pincer movement began to tell. Renly's men were forced to fight on two fronts, the Tully Fry host attacking from the west, Stannis's from the east. If either side could push deeper, they might break the center. Yet the Tyrell lines were disciplined, and they had more men. The question was whether shock and coordination could trump sheer numbers. Amid the chaos, Ned spotted the glimmer of a crown, a stag's crown, on a helm not far off. He realized it was Renly himself, perched on a warhorse, rallying a group of knights. His green cloak whipped in the wind. If they captured or killed Renly, the battle might end swiftly. But the swirling press of men, the mud, and the danger made any direct charge uncertain. Ned tried to angle toward him, but a knot of Tyrell men barred the way. Suddenly, in the thick gloom, horns blared. The cry of retreat or rally soared across the field. Ned could not tell which side was sounding it. Another peal of thunder rocked the sky. He glimpsed an entire flank of Tully men sagging under the weight of a Tyrell cavalry charge. The Freys, who had been in support, seemed to waver. Ned cursed under his breath. If the Freys broke, the Tully position might collapse. Then, from behind the Tully lines, new banners appeared. Blackfish's men, presumably held in reserve, charging forward with pikes to counter the Tyrell cavalry. In that instant, the Tyrell horse reeled, many riders unseated. The Tully front stabilized. The confusion was absolute. Ned pressed deeper, calling for the Northmen. He hammered aside a Tyrell knight, glimpsing Stannis again. The king battered a path toward Renly's cluster of knights. Ned saw the swirl of black and gold cloak. And then, in a flash of lightning, Stannis and Renly faced each other, blades drawn. Renly looked up, eyes wide with shock or rage, perhaps both. Stannis raised his sword. Ned gasped, urging his horse closer, but the press of men blocked him. For a heartbeat, the two brothers stared across the muddy chaos, swords half raised. Rain streamed down their armor. Neither moved. Then a new wave of knights separated them, and the moment passed. Stannis was carried away by the swirling melee, Renly likewise. Ned cursed, hacking at the foes in front of him, trying to break through. The battle wore on, minutes stretching into an eternity. Men screamed and fell. Horses thrashed. Mud churned underfoot. The steady hiss of arrow flights mixed with the staccato of steel on steel. Slowly, Ned began to sense a shift in momentum. The Tully forces, buoyed by the city's intervention, pressed Renly's main line hard. The Tyrell men had expected an easier time crushing the smaller Tully host. Now they found themselves in a brutal slog. The city force hammered their flank, the Tullys hammered the front. Renly's advantage in numbers was telling, but so was the confusion and the poor weather. At length, horns blared once more, clearer this time. Some of Renly's lines started to pull back, falling into a retreat formation. The Tyrell cavalry regrouped, forming a screen to protect the withdrawal. Ned realized that Renly was cutting his losses, calling a retreat to avoid being enveloped. If they could hold that retreat, they'd live to fight another day, but the siege might be broken. Ned urged men forward, shouting, "Press them! Press them!" hoping to turn the retreat into a rout. But the storm and the mud worked against them. Horses slipped, Men stumbled. The Tyrell rearguard fought ferociously, preventing a clean pursuit. Eventually, the battered remnants of Renly's host pulled west, leaving the field littered with bodies. Tully banners advanced to meet the city's banners in the middle ground, and in that meeting victory hung in the air, albeit a costly one. Soaked through, caked in mud, Ned realized the day was theirs, for now. He dismounted gingerly, surveying the carnage. Men lay strewn about, some moaning for help, others silent forever. Edmure Tully approached, helmet under one arm, blood streaming from a cut on his brow. He recognized Ned and mustered a weary grin. "We did it," Edmure breathed. "They're pulling back. But gods, the cost." Ned clasped Edmure's forearm. "We owe you thanks for coming to our aid." Edmure waved off the gratitude. "We came because we must. We lost too many men already to the Lannisters. Another tyrant was more than we could bear." Stannis rode up, breathing hard, his armor splashed in red. "We push after them," he declared, voice ringing. "We can't let Renly regroup and besiege us again." Ned wiped rain from his face. "Your Grace, our men are exhausted. If we push too far, they could ambush us. We've broken the immediate threat. Let them run." Stannis looked like he might argue, but then he swayed in his saddle, drained. "Very well," he muttered. "We reorganize, gather the wounded, let Renly lick his wounds in the west." Thus ended the rain-soaked battle that would come to be known as the Battle of the Stormed Fields or the Brothers' Clash, depending on whose bard told the tale. It was a harrowing victory for Stannis and Tully combined forces, forcing Renly to abandon the siege. That night, the battered victors tended their wounded by torchlight, wading through muck and gore. Ned found Robb on the field, having arrived with a small support group from the city once it was clear the tide had turned. Father and son embraced in relief. Casualties were high on both sides. Countless families would mourn. But King's Landing would not starve beneath Tyrell blockade. A battered triumph, yet a triumph nonetheless. In the coming days, they learned that Renly had withdrawn westward, heading for the Reach to rebuild. Many of his lords, especially Tarly, urged him to regroup. But rumors spread that some were disillusioned by the fiasco, that Renly had lost face by failing to deliver on an easy victory. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister remained a captive, Cersei remained under guard, and the Lannister children lingered in the Tower of the Hand, uncertain of their future. King Stannis, flush with victory but mindful of heavy losses, reasserted himself. He declared that the crown's position was now stronger than ever. He called for lords across the realm to bend the knee, brandishing the twin trophies of Tywin's capture and Renly's defeat. Whether that would lead to lasting peace or simply another chapter of war, none could say. But for Ned Stark, who had cast aside so many illusions to match Tywin's ruthlessness, there was at least a glimmer of hope that the realm might begin to heal. Still, even as the city breathed a sigh of relief, Ned felt the old gods stirring in his conscience. He had compromised his honor time and again, holding children hostage, forging alliances through fear. Yet the alternative had been total ruin. If the North was safe, if Sansa and Arya survived, if the realm found a foothold in peace, he would bear the shame. In time, perhaps, he could restore the balance of justice. That was the promise he made to the spirits of Winterfell in the quiet of his thoughts. As the city of King's Landing tried to clean the mud and blood from its gates, as Pycelle and the Maesters treated the wounded, as the small folk offered thanks for a respite from siege, Ned stood on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Rain clouds still drifted overhead, though the storm had passed. Robb, Edmure, and the Blackfish were below, organizing men. King Stannis, in the distance, conversed with Davos. For the first time since capturing Tywin, Ned felt the tension in his shoulders loosen the smallest fraction. A dreadful confrontation had been averted, if only for now. He closed his eyes, remembering the stark words he'd exchanged with Tywin in the Black Cells. He pictured Joffrey's furious stare. If the realm was to have any chance, they must not allow revenge or ambition to devour them from within. He had done what he must, learning from Tywin's cunning. Perhaps it was enough to steer the Seven Kingdoms toward a fragile new order. With a soft breath, Ned murmured a final vow. "I will see this through to the end, no matter the cost." Then he turned from the balcony, stepping back into the swirl of duty and turmoil that still gripped King's Landing. The future remained uncertain, shaped by the choices of men who played their game for the highest stakes. Yet for once, Eddard Stark stood as a powerful piece on that board, no longer naive, no longer so easily outmaneuvered. And though part of him grieved for the honor he had compromised, another part, the wolf in his heart, felt the grim resolve that might just save them all from the darkness gathering beyond the horizon.